Chapter 61. That night, Sulu, who was equally exhausted after completing the entire set of exercises in the dark, entered the bathroom again. After taking a cold shower, he seemed to feel much better. He took out the sharp knife from the hollowed-out tile behind the mirror and began to carefully shave his eyebrows in front of the mirror. Every strand of hair was trimmed very carefully. Finally, he applied some spring toning lotion between his eyebrows. He looked at his face in the mirror and nodded with satisfaction. Sulu did not have the habit of being narcissistic, nor did he have the intention to make his ordinary face handsome. Even if he did, he would not choose to do it in the wee hours of the morning, unless he was crazy. The advertisement on Channel 23 said that this toner could shrink pores, so he had been experimenting with it for the past 2 months. After scrutinizing his face in front of the mirror for a long time, he confirmed that the pores between his eyebrows were so small that they could not be seen. If he did not use a magnifying glass, he would definitely not be able to tell that there were eyebrows on his smooth skin. The most distinctive feature of his ordinary face was his pair of eyebrows. Back at the mining pit, Feng Yu had once said that his eyebrows were like knives, too straight, too straight. The purpose of trimming eyebrows was not to make his facial features more supple, but to alter the space between his eyebrows to change his appearance. After all, he did not dare to reveal his true identity. Although the Westwoods and Eastwood were extremely far away from the capital ring, who could be sure about the matters of the mortal world? Perhaps at some point in time, someone who had seen Su Lu before would come to Yue University. Su Li's eyebrows were originally as dark as ink, and they were joined together in the middle, looking like a sharp and unstoppable machete. For the past 2 months, he had been trimming his eyebrows non-stop because he wanted to cut off this pair of straight eyebrows from the middle. The results were not bad. At least, the face in the mirror was indeed slightly different from his original appearance, although the difference was not too obvious. If Su Li's eyebrows were previously like machetes, then now, his eyebrows were still as straight as before, but they had become 2 small throwing knives that were pointing at his temples. It was a sleepless night. Su Lu sat in the darkness, staring at the tightly shut iron door. Intuition was actually just a sensitive judgment triggered by countless subtle changes, or even a subconscious judgment. Su Lu was a person who was good at observing things. Feng Yu had once admired this trait of his, so he trusted his own intuition. What did the sudden arrival and silent departure of the principal, the sudden reopening of Zizaman a few days ago, and the absolute silence at the back gate of the school mean? He smelled the scent of danger, just like on the green grassland on the other side of the electronic fence. There seemed to be many wild beasts lurking in the grass. What made him uneasy was that he could not find where these dangers were at all. With his fingers gently stroking the metal handle in his palm, Su Lu narrowed his eyes. He knew that as long as he pushed the button, the front end of the gadget, which looked like a data storage device, would spurt out a strong current. When the accumulated current was used up, it could even eject a sharp dagger. With such a sharp weapon to protect himself, his mood calmed down a little. However, when he thought of the arrogant people in front of the nightclub pulling out their pistols on the street, his heart was no longer so calm. Years ago, he made 2 taser batons under the guidance of Feng Yu. In addition to giving one to Li Wei, which indirectly led to the subsequent events, the other one was always by his side for self-defense. It had electrocuted a bison and stunned the police chief. It was affectionately called Handle by him. When he left Heshi State, the handle had been cremated with the chip in the incinerator. The one in his hand was made a month ago. The department he was attending hadn't started their experimental classes yet, but it wasn't difficult to find suitable materials on campus. After ordering some special components online, Su Lu made this thing again and finally gave it a name. It was called Flying Dagger. The long night passed by as Su Lu waited. The horizon gradually brightened, and the 2 faint shadows of the moon in the sky above planet S1 gradually disappeared from the horizon. A kind of gray haze began to cover the sky. The air was filled with the smell of freshness and coolness. The morning breeze blew around Pear Garden, but it blew the light fog closer and closer, thicker and thicker. Although it was already morning, it was still the first morning. The people on campus were still sleeping, and the insects that had been chirping all night felt tired. One by one, they stopped singing. The surroundings were quiet. Sulu was already sleepy. He laughed at himself. He thought to himself that he was not as experienced as the uncle in escaping. Just a random thought had made him nervous for an entire night. If this continued, he was afraid that he would die from exhaustion even before the Federation government came to catch him. He opened the window to let the breeze in. Then, he prepared to turn on the lights and go back to bed to catch up on sleep. However, just as his finger was about to touch the touch switch, he heard a strange sound. The electronic switch of Yue University's deserted rear iron gate emitted a soft beep. Then, the gate slowly opened in the thin morning fog. Sulu looked at this scene in astonishment. His hand tightened around the flying dagger. The fact that the iron gate opened without his knowledge could only mean that someone with higher authority in the university had entered a command without his knowledge. If he was still sleeping, he definitely wouldn't have heard the beep. That way, no matter who entered the campus, he wouldn't know. At this moment, although he was astonished, he also let go of the worry in his heart. He believed that the strange guest that was about to arrive was definitely not looking for trouble with him. That was because, regardless of the time period, no one would use such an open and aboveboard method to hunt him down. Furthermore, opening the school gate and capturing him didn't seem to be related at all. However, this scene did look a little strange. In the thin fog, the iron gate slowly opened, but there wasn't a single person around. It looked like a horror scene that was commonly seen in movies. A completely black car quickly drove in from the fog, following the road outside the university towards Pear Garden. Just by looking at the dispersing white fog, one could tell how fast the car was traveling. However, at such a speed, the black car didn't make any sound. It looked like a ghost that appeared and disappeared. What was strange was that when Sulu saw the black car, he felt that the smell of danger around him seemed to have lessened significantly. His strong curiosity made him walk to the window and secretly peek at the scene. He couldn't understand how such an extremely ordinary-looking car without a logo could drive so smoothly and naturally. It even gave off a lively feeling. Suddenly, Sulu noticed that a figure had appeared in the thin fog on campus at some point. It was a female student wearing glasses. She was wearing a set of floral pajamas and hugging a book as she walked sleepily on the road to Pear Garden. There was still some distance to the apartment building, and it had been especially quiet recently. However, there were still students who coveted the beautiful scenery of Pear Garden and came here for their morning study. However, very few students woke up this early for morning study. At this moment, Sulu didn't have time to consider why the female student would suddenly appear here. This was because he realized that the figure of the female student, whose eyes were not fully open, was blurry in the fog. And the black car driving in from outside the university didn't seem to have noticed her, continuing to drive at high speed. If nothing unexpected happened, perhaps in a few seconds, that poor female student would be hit by that strange black car and sent flying into the sky to see the scenery of Pear Garden. There was no time to shout because the person in the car couldn't hear him. Furthermore, Sulu had a feeling that even if the other party heard him, they wouldn't slow down. As for that sleepy and confused female student, Sulu didn't dare hope that he could wake her up. Therefore, he directly jumped out of the window and rushed toward the female student as fast as he could. He was even faster than when he was racing with the bison. He directly threw the female student onto the grass by the side of the road. Just as the two of them fell to the ground, the black car drove past them at high speed like a ghost. It didn't slow down, didn't stop, and didn't even pay attention to the episode that happened here. It only stirred up a few green leaves on the ground as it disappeared into the foggy campus. The moment Sulu rushed out, he suddenly felt countless gazes on him. However, following the scene that happened later, those gazes disappeared at the same time. However, at this moment, the youth's mood was somewhat angry. He was angry at that car that didn't care about life or death, so he couldn't care less about these strange feelings. He angrily glared at the back of that black car and cursed under his breath. Zhang Xiaomeng endured the pain in her knee and struggled to stand up from the young man's embrace. She glanced in the direction that the black car disappeared in from the corner of her eyes. Incomparable disappointment and anger welled up in her heart. The councilman arranged for her to return to Yue University in order to make contact with that person. In order to obtain information about that person entering the campus from the back door in the wee hours of the morning, how much effort did the people of S2 put in? She also understood that this kind of coincidental encounter was too risky, but she had no choice. Just as things were developing according to plan, they were interrupted by an accident. However, when she turned around to look at the person, she was surprised to see a familiar face. Especially the sincere concern on the face and the sincerity in the eyes, it made her remember who the other person was, the person who shared the puppy biscuits with her. Zhang Xiaomeng stared into Su Li's eyes in shock. She felt as if Su Li's gaze was like two flying daggers staring into her eyes. For a moment, she panicked and forgot her most important task. At this time, Su Lu was also stunned. He realized that the girl in his arms was the same innocent girl he met on the bus when school started. His palm felt very soft to the touch. He then realized that he was still hugging her waist and buttocks. A breath of spring hit him in the face, and he suddenly turned into a stiff rock in the Donglin countryside. When the young man and woman turned into statues, the black car had already passed through the thin mist. In the back seat of the car, a young man about 17 or 18 years old opened his tired eyes and subconsciously looked back. Beside him, a person who looked like a butler said respectfully, "Please rest assured, young master. Although the family still can't send anyone, the Special Task Force has taken the initiative to send 12 special agents. They will definitely ensure your safety while you study here. Uncle Jean, please call me by my name, Tai Ziyuan," the young man said sincerely. He suddenly laughed bitterly. "I keep feeling like someone was glaring at me just now. It was so fierce, like two throwing knives. It seems that our family is quite annoying in the Federation." Chapter 62. In this S2 Regional Council election, the members of the opposition did not exceed the predictions of election experts. They successfully won 243 seats and successfully took control of the management committees of the 4 administrative states. Politicians in the Federation's capital ring have accused these members of the opposition, who are used to communicating in private. As a result, Article 2 of the Federation Charter, which has maintained the political balance of the Federation for 600 years, has become a piece of paper. The courtyard was filled with green bamboos. Against the backdrop of the natural scenery, the light screen hanging on the snow-white wall looked more like a picture. However, at this time, the famous female reporter from Channel 4 of the Federation had a serious expression on her face. She was blabbering on endlessly. 30 years ago, when the banner of George Carlin was raised, the anti-government forces gave up on resisting the Federation by force. Instead, they pursued the principle of non-violence and non-cooperation. However, starting 5 years ago, the anti-government forces began to change their attitude. Under the framework of negotiations with the Federation government, they participated in the political election affairs of the Federation. The leader of the anti-government forces, Medellin, is a strong supporter and promoter of this big change. Medellin was elected as a member of the S2 administrative region 4 years ago. According to sources, Medellin is preparing to participate in this autumn's election of the Federation Management Committee and run for the position of a member of the Federation. Deep in the courtyard, a middle-aged man wearing glasses and a black double-breasted retro suit silently watched the light screen and listened to the female reporter's analysis. This time, the anti-government forces. The female reporter's face on the screen was slightly flustered, but she quickly regained her composure. The reason why the opposition members of the parliament were able to win the local elections of the S2 administrative region was because the 4 mountainous states of S2 were the actual areas of the opposition. On the eve of the election, the results of the investigation of the strange explosion in the Eastwood region in year 65 of the constitutional calendar were announced, which dealt a heavy blow to the traditional members of the Federation. The opposition members have presented evidence to prove that the President's office, the Special Task Force, the Ministry of Defense, and the Management Committee were all involved in concealing the truth of the explosion. This has caused the public's disappointment in the political figures to reach a new level. The middle-aged man's brows furrowed slightly, shaking his head with a sigh. He listened to the female reporter on the screen speak with a trace of excitement. Although the president immediately ordered an investigation into this matter, and announced to the public through the Bureau of Proclamation that the spring of year 65 of the constitutional calendar, the accidental death of 300 soldiers in the Donglin region's Heshi province, as well as the serious damage to the surface of the residential area, resulting in an irreversible ecological disaster, was due to a secret operation by the Federation against the Bureau of Proclamation's #1 target, the treasonous mechanic Yufeng. However, this explanation still doesn't satisfy the public, because no one can understand why such an open operation would be hidden for an entire year, and all the news media didn't receive the slightest bit of news. In the face of the opposition members' accusations, the Federation has given the most serious response. The spokesperson of the Ministry of Defense has publicly accused the opposition of not abiding by the treaty, and of still having armed forces in the S2 administrative region. Senator Macklin's office issued a press release yesterday, sternly denying this accusation, and warning the Federation government not to try to divert the public's attention. They demanded that the government explain why the operation against mechanic Yufeng was deliberately hidden for so long, and what secrets there are behind this matter. The following is the background information of the news. Mechanic Yufeng, once an assistant instructor in mecha repair at the capital planet's second military academy, was recruited into the army at the end of the Third War between the Federation and the Empire. The middle-aged man adjusted his glasses, shaking his head as he turned off the light-screen television. He knew more about Mechanic Yufeng's information than most people in this world, even more than the Federation government and the leader of the opposition, Macklin. He walked towards the green courtyard, passing by a few paddy fields and a few red carp ponds, and the heaviness in his heart gradually dissipated. Although his family was sparse, and far from being as powerful as the legendary 7 big families, to be able to own such a large manor in Philadelphia, the middle-aged man knew how much trust and respect the people of the Federation had for his family. After walking for a few minutes, the middle-aged man came to the front of a flat lake. He looked at the side of the lake and lowered his head. "Father, the news about Uncle has been confirmed. Just as you expected, he should be gone. The information we got from the Ministry of Defense was half a year late." Philadelphia, 1,300 kilometers away from the capital, was a tourist destination that was warm in winter and cool in summer. To be able to own such a large manor in such a place where every inch of land was worth its weight in gold, it was enough to show the status of the people who lived here. This lake was so long that one couldn't tell how big it was. A gentle breeze blew, and the water was still, like a mirror reflecting the snowy peaks of the mountains in the distance, making one feel that nothing could be more beautiful than this. An old man was sitting on a bluestone by the lake. He was wearing a very simple but slightly retro long gown. His long white hair was scattered behind him, and his back looked very old. However, the appearance of this old man didn't affect this picturesque scenery. The slightly thin and old body seemed to have stayed by the lake for countless years, and had already become one with the lake and the mountain. Hearing the middle-aged man's words, the old man slowly lowered his head and looked at the clear lake in front of him. He seemed to be sad, but also seemed to be relieved. He said, "It's good that he's dead. He should have died 40 years ago, and he should have died 14 years ago. But he didn't die, and he will never die. The sooner I die, the sooner I'll be relieved. I'm already willing to die." Hearing these ominous words, the middle-aged man was shocked. He was worried that his father would be too sad because of the news of his uncle's death. Although he didn't know the strange relationship between his father and his uncle, he had heard too much about his uncle's deeds since he was a child. He knew that his father had always cared about his younger brother. He walked up behind the old man and said with concern, "Uncle was able to escape the Federation's arrest in the past. He might be able to do the same this time. I don't want to care about these things. A brother who has disappeared for several decades is no different from being dead." The old man's back view was bleak, but the middle-aged man's gaze remained respectful. Although they were father and son, he always felt that his father was more like the image that the Federation had promoted. Since he was a child, he had always felt a sense of distance from his father. The old man sighed, his voice filled with extremely complicated emotions. "Your uncle was a genius. No matter what he did, he could do it to the extreme. Back then, he made great contributions to the Federation's development. It's just that he was a liberal. The things he thought in his head were things that even I couldn't understand. He never considered what others thought when he did things. There's an old saying that if you sowed evil, you would have to bear evil consequences. Since he had violated the Federation's laws, caused the deaths of so many people, and caused so much trouble, perhaps his death could be considered some form of compensation to those innocent people." The middle-aged man knew that his father wasn't referring to the great explosion that had occurred when they had attacked the Empire. He didn't know much about those things from the distant past. After a moment of silence, he said, "The President's personal letter arrived last night. Would you like to take a look?" After a moment of silence, the old man said, "I respect the spirit of the Federation, and I also respect the representative of the Federation, Mr. President. However, I don't want to look at that letter. I don't want an outsider to tell me that they had already killed my younger brother a year ago, even though I don't mind killing him with my own hands. The only one who knows about the relationship between your uncle and me is that woman from the Thai family. Mr. President might have only found out recently. Right now, I'm just a statue of the Federation. Of course, he wouldn't want me to have anything to do with that notorious mechanic. A few decades ago, I punched your uncle and knocked out 17 of his teeth. From that day onwards, I cut all ties with him, and we haven't had any contact since." The old man slowly stood up from the rock. Looking at the restless bubbles in the calm lake, he felt his old heart gradually become empty. "There are some people in the government who have always wanted to get your uncle's star map, while there are others who don't want that star map to be leaked. With these two powerful forces joining forces, no matter how many times your uncle can split himself, it's impossible for him to hide safely forever. I don't understand. My uncle is a person who loves to be in a lively situation." Every time the middle-aged man thought of his uncle, who was the most unknown but also the most talented in the family, he felt a chill run down his spine. Back when the Bureau of Proclamation first issued a warrant for his arrest, he still took the risk to stay in the various academies on the capital planet. Why has he been willing to stay in the Donglin district for the past 10 years or so? Nowadays, Donglin is so deserted. In the past, he was willing to stay in S1 and play different roles because he always had the wrong idea. He thought that the glory of the first charter was a humiliation, so he took the risk to stay here, to challenge the eyes of the first charter in the most dangerous place. Underneath this kind of nonsense lies his madness and courage. Why did he leave? Naturally, it was because he thought that the first charter was no longer a shackle to his freedom. Naturally, he didn't want to continue playing this game. The reason he went to Donglin, I am probably the only one in the world who can understand. Under the twilight, the disappearance of a fragment of civilization, how breathtaking and beautiful it is. The old man said calmly, "This is what your uncle wanted to see when he went to Donglin. The things he was searching for in this universe are incomprehensible to normal people. It is only after I have grown old that I understand the choice he made back then. From a certain perspective, I am still not as good as him." The middle-aged man looked at his father's back quietly. The family had produced 2 top figures in the previous generation, but one of them was famous throughout the Federation and the Empire. During the First War, he successfully assassinated the ambitious emperor of the Empire. In this era where individual heroism had long since declined, he became the #1 hero of the Federation. The other valiantly fought against the glory of the First Charter for his entire life. In the end, he died quietly as a small character and a traitor. Now, his uncle was dead, and his father was old. How would the Lees of Philadelphia continue in the future? He stayed in Donglin for more than 10 years. There should be some people close to him. The war god of the Federation was just an old man reminiscing about the past. He said slowly, "He has always been a cold-blooded man. I am afraid he will not care about the lives of those after his death. Go and investigate. If there is anyone close to him, help them in secret if you can. I have already investigated." Uncle had an apprentice in Donglin, and they were quite close. However, that apprentice was unfortunately killed in an operation by the Federation, the middle-aged man replied respectfully. The old man looked at the lake and thought to himself, "No matter whether you are dead or alive, you and I are brothers. We are just two men." Chapter 63. In the manner of the Lees of Philadelphia, who had been shrouded in a heroic aura for decades, the war god Li Pifu, who was incomparably respected by the citizens of the Federation, had seriously considered taking care of a pitiful and innocent little apprentice. Unfortunately, according to the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation, the little apprentice was already dead. Therefore, everyone in the Federation believed that the little apprentice could not possibly still be alive. Of course, Sulu was not dead. He also did not know that the Lees of Philadelphia had tried to find him and take care of him. He also did not know that Uncle Feng Yu had any relationship with the Lees of Philadelphia. Even the rotten teeth that he had ridiculed for many years were actually, personally knocked out by the war god. If he knew these shocking secrets, would he have touched Feng Yu's rotten teeth with a gaze of worship? If he knew all of these, perhaps he would understand why, in the bloody twilight above the mine, when Uncle Feng Yu mentioned the old man that everyone in the Federation respected, he actually used the 3 words, "old man," without any respect. At this time, Sulu was eating in a simple 3-story building. He used a knife and fork to strenuously cut the wild beef on his plate. From time to time, he would raise his head to look at the unstable light patterns on the wall. The television was still talking about the election of the local state management committee members, and it also mentioned the secret operation in the Eastwoods region. Any secret operation of the Federation could be labeled as a shady operation by the opposition members. Using George Carlin's theory, they would hoarsely criticize it. However, as the person involved, Sulu did not have this kind of interest. He knew that there was a shady operation behind the uncle's death, but that shady operation should have fallen many years ago. The wild beef on the plate was very hard. He had just dug it out of the freezer yesterday. He did not know how many years it had been frozen, but the meat did not have any freshness. Fortunately, it did not go bad. He ate it like a piece of wood and digested it. For Sulu, it was much better than synthetic food. At this time, it was already the end of summer. The air conditioning system that he had just repaired began to send in a cool breeze, but it did not have time to drive away the heat. He wiped the sweat on his forehead and finished the beef on the plate as fast as he could. He rubbed his stomach and somewhat unsatisfied walked into the house. He began to rummage and memorize the bits and pieces. According to the government's Land Management Bureau, this 3-story building belonged to Sulu. In other words, this was the home of the retired soldier Sulu. 6 months into Yue University's summer vacation, Sulu took out the ticket that he had bought a long time ago and embarked on the journey back to his home. In order to live a safer life in the Federation, he had to know where his home was. He had to familiarize himself with the local life and customs as much as possible, and even the possible accent. This way, he would not give himself away as much as possible. Shi Qinghai easily saw that he was a person with a secret, so Sulu had to be more cautious. However, he did not expect that the home that the uncle had set for his disguise chip was so far away. He took a 7-hour flight from Linhai Airport, an 11-hour bus ride, and finally walked for half a day before he arrived at this small town. He had already stayed in this small town for a few days, and he was more and more shocked by Uncle Feng Yu's ability. The choice of this small town was too awesome. Not only was it remote, but because of the landslides, most of the residents had moved into the new settlement opened by the state government. Even the few residents who stayed in the town had mostly forgotten who the three-story building belonged to. It was a very inexplicable thing, wasn't it? In fact, it was just the burden of life that made the few residents lose all interest in inquiring about gossip. The town's primary school and middle school had been closed a few years ago, which made Sulu feel more at ease. He was also endlessly curious about phone usability. To be able to choose such a perfect disguise, one must enter the high-level central control computer of the Federation for a long time to filter through the information. It even meant that phone you had once hacked into the all-knowing central control computer of the Bureau of Proclamation. Sulu took a shower and stood on the balcony, memorizing the scenery of the small town and the unique plants in his mind. At the same time, he connected the information with reality again to strengthen his memory. He subconsciously touched the metal bracelet on his wrist and thought of the chips on the thin metal wires inside. A single chip represented a brand new identity that no one knew about. If it was as difficult to find a loophole as his current identity, how long would it take to prepare? Thinking of the wild beef hidden in the freezer for many years, a sincere and praying smile appeared on Su Li's ordinary and sincere face. After ending the summer trip back to his hometown, Sulu returned to Linhai University after a long and arduous journey. In addition to confirming his new identity, this trip also gave him some mental impact. Only now did he know that the Eastwoods region was not the poorest region in the Federation. That small town, called Light, was the one that was truly poor. He could not understand how such a prosperous and developed federation, especially on the most core planet of the capital ring, could exist in such a place. There was even a profession like a farmer, and not the kind that was performed on stage. Thinking of the pair of siblings he had met before, Sulu had a deeper understanding of the injustice of this society. However, he did not know how this injustice came about, and how to solve it. Subconsciously, he still did not have a good impression of the Federation government. Instead, he was curious about the anti-government forces and vaguely recognized them. At the beginning of September, the campus of Yua University opened again. Sulu once again began his boring, shuttling back and forth between the teaching buildings and his room. As expected, Yua University's basic engineering education had a strength that did not match its reputation. Sulu eagerly absorbed the knowledge, such as the operating principle of the Jingnong brand's high-energy storage battery, the data compatibility parameters of the three systems in a closed structure, the law of the automatic layer jumping of the crystal ores under illumination. Tomorrow, he would begin to enter the laboratory building and begin practical learning. When Sulu thought of this, he felt the skin on his hands begin to itch. It had been more than a year since he left Eastwoods and the miners' operation room. Other than making himself a self-defense stun baton, it had been a long time since he came into contact with electronic boards, pipes, and metal. That wonderful tactile feeling and the faint smell of high-energy plastic made him miss them very much. What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about applying for a job at Shanglin Guogue Company in the future? A low and cold voice pulled Sulu out of his thoughts. Stunned, he stopped rubbing his hands and looked at the girl across the table. He smiled awkwardly and said, "I was thinking about tomorrow's experiment class. Will Professor Zhou let us assemble the equipment ourselves?" Yes, in the peaceful university life, the biggest change in Su Li's life was probably the girl across the table who habitually wore high-heeled glasses. She was so quiet and pure that she even seemed a little cold. When the black phantom car drove into Pear Garden, Su Lu and Zhang Xiaoming both recognized each other. From that day onwards, they would occasionally meet on campus. As the number of nods and greetings increased, they began to sit together and eat. Although this attracted many puzzled gazes, they did not understand why Zhang Xiaoming, who came from a good family, would be so close to the gatekeeper. Although Su Lu did not like to be the center of attention, he still liked to sit together with Zhang Xiaoming. Zhang Xiaoming looked at the nerd across from her and sighed in her heart. The Federation Investigation Bureau surveillance team finally withdrew after a semester. The students on campus had also gotten used to their return from S2. Everything returned to normal. The target she wanted to get in touch with seemed to have disappeared from the campus forever. If this continued, she even wondered if she had really become an innocent student. Eating with Sulu didn't mean anything to her. She just thought that a retired soldier who worked as a concierge, studied in school, and wanted to enter the Nutshell Company as a mechanical engineer in the future was really a very hardworking young man. She appreciated this very much. At the same time, she wanted to treat Sulu to a few more meals. Perhaps it was because she once ate his dog biscuits and misunderstood him. Also, she guessed that Suli's financial situation was not particularly good. As for why they met at the airport bus, she thought it was because of the benefits given by the Department of Defense for retired soldiers. Next month is the Double Moon Festival. There's a school dance. Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him and said, I need a male companion. Are you willing to go with me? After hearing this request, Sulu did not immediately speak. Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him quietly. She did not understand why she suddenly made such a request. Seeing that Sulu did not speak for a long time, a trace of disappointment flashed through her heart. She was not disappointed that Sulu refused, but that Sulu was afraid of being looked at differently and retreated. Maybe she really did have to go to that boring but necessary dance alone. I have the money to buy suitable clothes. If you don't have a blind date at the ball, and if you don't have people chasing after you, you don't need me to be your temporary boyfriend or shield. Sulu looked up and said seriously, then I'm willing to go with you. Hearing so many prerequisites, Zhang Xiaomeng was not angry. Instead, she smiled happily. A bright light flashed through her glasses. Chapter 64. Even though your smile right now is very lewd, which is similar to my shameless style, but I still have to tell you a big piece of bad news. I'm sorry to wake you up from your wet dream. Yue University's afternoon weather was always so warm, making people feel lazy. Sulu looked at the familiar pretty face outside the iron gate and the lewd smile on the lazy rogue official's face. He couldn't help but curse. If you have something to say it quickly. In the past few months, Shi Qinghai had been busy with work, but no one knew what he was busy with. In any case, he had lost a lot of weight. However, this weight loss made the lines of his face more distinct. Coupled with that pair of mesmerizing peach blossom eyes, he had lost a little of his charm and added a little of his heroic spirit, which attracted the burning gazes of those middle-aged female creatures. Shi Qinghai passed a cigarette through the gap between the iron gate and lit one for himself. He said seriously, the Zhou family siblings arrived in Linhai yesterday. You have to be careful. Don't go out of school until I give you the exact news. Su Li's fingers froze, and he didn't light the cigarette. He was stunned for a moment before he remembered the two faces that weren't ugly, but were extremely annoying. In the past few months, he had been busy learning the basics of mechanics, practicing martial arts every night, and experiencing the youth that suddenly hit his waist. He had actually forgotten about this matter. He looked at Shi Qinghai and asked, where did you get the news? Don't forget that I'm a field agent. Shi Qinghai's tone was not relaxed. He also felt unlucky. Last time, he took a huge risk and opened fire in front of the nightclub. He wanted to muddy the waters. But he didn't expect that the big boss of the Ministry of National Defense would be so shameless as to send his own children after a few months. Shi Qinghai wasn't afraid of the other party's revenge. As long as he had a gun, not many people could deal with him. The problem was Su Lu. He was very worried about his only friend. No matter how good a young concierge was at fighting, he would never be a match for those people. What made Shi Qinghai most upset was that it was all his fault that Su Lu had offended that pair of siblings. Is there such a vengeful person in this world? Su Lu of course knew that there really were such people in the world. Those big shots in the upper echelons of society, once their reputation was damaged, they definitely wouldn't stop until they took it back even more severely. You said that the major was from the 3rd Military Region. Could it be that he was specially transferred to Linhai to deal with us? They naturally didn't come to Linhai for us, but I'm afraid they're very willing to deal with us two dogs who dare to bark. Shi Qinghai's beautiful eyes flashed with a trace of gloominess. Looking at Su Li's honest and ordinary face, he thought that if that pair of siblings really did mess around, he would have no choice but to be ruthless. The worst that could happen was that he would be fired from the organization. But firing and purging seemed to be words of agreement. He suddenly thought of this and felt that his chest was wide open. He smiled at Su Lu and said, "Don't worry too much, leave it to me." "But, you have to tell me, why were you smiling so obscenely under the sun just now? Did something good happen?" Su Lu was stunned, but Shi Qinghai's expression changed. He looked at him seriously and said, "Don't tell me that this is your first time in a relationship." Su Lu didn't nod or shake his head. He was just in a daze. Shi Qinghai stared at him for a long time, then suddenly said seriously, "Don't be fooled, bro. What is love? Love is a cunt." Although Shi Qinghai wasn't a gentleman, and could even be said to be a hoodlum who had ruined many girls, he rarely said such vulgar words. After hearing this, Su Lu didn't get angry. He frowned and said, "Love is the staring of eyes, the friction of flesh, and the exchange of body fluids." These three sentences suddenly shocked Shi Qinghai. He looked at Su Lu as if he was looking at a stranger. He thought to himself, how could this seemingly honest guy come up with such a vulgar and incomparably accurate argument? He didn't pay attention to Su Lu, who was still in a daze, and walked towards the black official car. Sitting in the driver's seat, he looked at Su Lu, who was still leaning against the seat under the sun, and shook his head. He didn't have much time to care about Su Li's personal affairs. In the past few months, he had mobilized all the resources at hand, but still couldn't find the location of that crown prince in the university. Sometimes he even wondered why the organization valued this young man so much. Was there such a person in the world? Shi Qinghai drove away, leaving behind a dazed Su Lu. He raised his head and looked at the slightly glaring sunlight. He remembered that yesterday, he and Zhang Xiaomeng had walked slowly on the track in the sports field under such sunlight. Countless students had looked at them strangely. It seemed that he had become famous against his will. The three sentences about love were often nagged by Uncle Fengyu, who often visited the leisure center. Su Lu said it subconsciously, but in his heart, he couldn't agree with such a blatant point of view. Could he and Zhang Xiaomeng have a future? Without needing more time to think, Su Lu denied this point. Su Lu gave Zhang Xiaomeng a very good first impression. He was a sincere and kind young man. Later on, she found that Su Lu had more good points. For example, he was motivated, hardworking, and focused. But what could she do? She could only carefully keep a distance from him, but she also coveted that trace of sincerity. After all, one day she would leave Yue University and return to the councilman's side to help him deal with those complicated matters. She often reminded herself not to be too greedy. This period of peaceful school life was enough. After all, he was just an ordinary person. Maybe he could really achieve his dream of entering the Shell Motor Company, but what did that have to do with her? Su Lu knew how he felt about Zhang Xiaomeng. He only felt that her eyes, covered by black-rimmed glasses, were very calm and attractive. As a young man under the age of 20, this was the first time he had such one-on-one contact with a member of the opposite sex. He couldn't help but start to glow. He liked to sit with her, but he also had to carefully keep a distance. It wasn't because of those strange and surprised gazes, nor was it because of her excellent family background. It was because of his own problem. He didn't know when the Federation's soldiers would come to arrest him. Su Lu had never been in a relationship before, and neither had Zhang Xiaomeng, but they were both at the age of falling in love. It was like the trees in the pear garden that would naturally grow in spring. Interestingly, they didn't know what love was, but they started to like this feeling. But because of some practical or absurd reasons, they kept a distance, so that the feelings that they might or might not have were only in their hearts. Since it was only in their hearts that no one could see, they naturally couldn't talk about whether they liked it or not. Their current interactions were like the trees in the pear garden that were tied up with iron wires. It was clumsy and cute. In the clean and spotless operation room, Zhang Xiaomeng was clumsily and adorably operating a small laser welding machine. She was trying to join the metal parts on the operation table together. Although she had excellent comprehension in other areas, she was clumsy when it came to moving her hands. Outside her operation room, a few male students watched her operation with concerned eyes. They were so anxious that they wanted to rush in and replace her. Time always made people forget everything. Today's students had long forgotten Zhang Xiaomeng's childish behavior of taking a year off from school to go to Administrative District S2. In their eyes, Zhang Xiaomeng was a very beautiful and pleasant female student. She also happened to have a good family background and a good personality. Although there were rumors on campus recently that Zhang Xiaomeng had become strange again and liked to hang out with that poor janitor, they weren't willing to believe it. According to the inside information from the female dormitory, Zhang Xiaomeng also completely denied the possibility of being with that poor guy. Perhaps because they were distracted, they kept the same speed. The few male students subconsciously turned their heads and looked at a completely transparent operation room. Then, they were shocked to hear a beep. 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Professor Zhou, who was wearing a control suit, stared at the display screen with a look of disbelief. He shouted at the young man inside, "Su Lu. You're a fucking genius. Yesterday you broke the school's 3-piece assembly record, and today you broke the B blueprint record. Fuck. If it weren't for the fact that you only scored single digits in history, politics, and economics, I would definitely recommend you to the school to become a free official student. I would even recommend you to the first military academy." It was said that Professor Zhou used to be a regiment-level mechanical engineer in a large assembly center of the Ministry of National Defense. He still had a strong military style. His voice was very loud, and it shook the entire laboratory building. Not to mention, at this time, he was shouting with wild joy. For a moment, all the students heard what he said. They looked at the transparent operation room with envy and shock. Zhang Xiaomeng, who was clumsily performing the micro-operation of the 4th solder joint through the planar magnifying glass, raised her head in shock. She took off her black-rimmed glasses and looked to the side. She never would have thought that the unusually ordinary-looking boy would have a talent in this area that even Professor Zhou was shocked by. The door of the transparent console room opened, and Su Lu, whose back was already drenched in sweat, walked out. She wiped the sweat that was about to drip from her hair with her sleeves and pretended not to see the surprised looks around her. She nodded at Professor Zhou. The operation skills taught by Uncle Fengyu were used to complete the school operation practice, so naturally, he was much faster than the students. He was just a little helpless. Once he touched the tools, he would be distracted. He tried his best to slow down from his infatuated state. He was so anxious that he even broke out in cold sweat, but in the end, it seemed that he was still a little too fast. Chapter 65. The burly and tan Professor Zhou did not look like a well-respected professor on a university campus. He looked more like a man in the military who was exposed to the sun all day long. At this time, in the single office, his voice was still extremely loud. He shouted loudly at Su Lu, who was standing in front of him, "All the stars in the individual star systems of the Federation are called suns by us, and are called suns for short." Su Lu. Fuck. How the fuck did you do it so fast? Did you learn it before? Tell me the truth. In the past few days of the practical classes, Su Lu had displayed extremely powerful operation ability under the shocked gazes of everyone. This kind of thing was very familiar, so even if he wanted to hide it, there was no way to hide it too well. Professor Zhou knew that this auditing student was still working part-time in the school's gatehouse. He also knew that this kid was a soldier who had just been discharged for half a year. He stared at him curiously, as if he did not understand. When I was a recruit, there was a chain artillery camp next to the camp. I secretly went there a few times to check it out. Sulu repeated the resume and information of this identity in his mind and lowered his head. Then you are a fucking genius. Professor Zhou picked up the teacup and drank 2 mouthfuls. He suddenly frowned and said seriously, but this doesn't mean anything. These are the most basic things, and in the future, they may not be useful in practical work. In this kind of open class, the most important thing is your design ideas. After all, we are a university, not a place to train mechanic soldiers. Even in terms of speed, you are not the fastest. Every time in the Ministry of Defense's recruitment assessment, those crazy soldiers in the assembly base are faster than you. Do you understand? Understood. Sulu replied loudly, but in his heart, he did not agree with the professor's opinion. He inherited the style of the boss uncle, and his goal was to be faster, smoother, and more accurate. His goal was to be more economical, convenient, and to be able to use local materials. In other words, this damn kid was still subconsciously preparing to repair battleships and mechas like household appliances. However, Sulu really liked what Professor Zhou said after that. He knew that he was not too out of the ordinary as a mechanic freak, and would not attract the attention of that bastard of the Central Charter. It's a pity that you've already retired from the military. Otherwise, you should have directly applied to become a mechanic in the Ministry of Defense. Studying in a military academy would have been more suitable for you. Professor Zhou said with some regret, if you apply for the exam as a citizen now, you'll be a bit older. Also, you'll have to wait for 2 years. It's not worth it. How about this? You study hard, and I'll find an opportunity to discuss with the student office to see if we can transfer you to an official student. As for the tuition fees, you don't have to worry too much. The Federation still has a lot of scholarships and subsidies every year. Sulu knew that Professor Zhou was telling the truth. Every year, the Federation would invest a large amount of money into his education. However, the procedures for reviewing scholarships and grants were very strict. If his results were good enough and he had someone like Professor Zhou as a guarantor, he might be able to become an official student. If he could get a diploma, it would be a great help for him to enter the Shell Motor Company in the future. He stood at attention and said loudly, "Thank you, Professor." "Oh right, this is the access card for the library section H. The materials and tools there are more complete. Some of the declassified blueprints and data from the Ministry of Defense are also stored in the computers there. I think it's more suitable for your level." Professor Zhou took out a small card and threw it over. Sulu caught it and continued to say loudly, "Thank you, Professor." Holding the small electronic access card, Sulu left the office. Although he had said many thanks and was somewhat curious about the library section H that he had never heard of before, Sulu's mind was still echoing with another sentence from Professor Zhou. The Ministry of Defense Mechanic Exam. Sulu's lips curled into a bitter smile. He remembered the yearning for the future of life in the remote Donglin mine. However, he was now on the most prosperous and advanced planet of the Federation's capital. Moreover, he was now on the path to realizing his second dream. What was there to be dissatisfied about? Sulu took a deep breath and dispelled the shadow in his heart. However, he knew very well that there were still many things that he was dissatisfied with. At this time, Professor Zhou had already left the office. He took the elevator to the top floor and met with the principal of Yue University through his secretary. He looked at the elegant face of the principal and said, "The student you talked about is really not bad. I've already given him the access card for the library section H." The principal raised his head from the large office desk and looked at him in confusion. He asked, "You're talking about that young man called Sulu? I thought you had already given him the access card." "Why?" "Students who haven't gone through my personal inspection can forget about obtaining the best teaching resources in the Federation." Professor Zhou disagreed with the principal's words. The principal sighed and took off his glasses. He placed them on the table and said, "You're really messing around. Since I've already told you, just do as I say. That won't do. Your presbyopia is too serious now, and you're not willing to go for laser surgery. Speaking of which, it's only a matter of 2 minutes. Why do you have to wear glasses like that? Professor Zhou continued to nag. I still have to personally inspect him. Not only do I have to inspect his knowledge structure and practical ability, but I also have to inspect his moral character. This kid is not bad. Every time I ask him to carry the heaviest things, he doesn't complain at all. He's also not stupid enough to think that a professor like me is discriminating against a penniless auditing student like him. The principal frowned and waved his hand. This young man has a recommendation letter written by Professor Jean. Although I'm not sure how this young man is so lucky to know Professor Jean, since that recommendation letter is real, I naturally believe in Professor Jin's judgment. What's there to inspect? You're talking about old Jean. Professor Zhou's expression changed. He's been gone for more than 20 years. How is he still alive? Fuck, if I knew this was old Jin's secret student, I wouldn't have embarrassed myself by teaching him. He's not old Jin's student. He's just a very enthusiastic and talented student that he met by chance. The principal could not get used to Professor Zhou's attitude. He shook his head disapprovingly. Old Jean said in the letter that we shouldn't let that kid know that he wrote a recommendation letter. Professor Zhou was stunned. Wasn't that kid the one who brought that recommendation letter? That's why I said that you don't have to inspect that kid's moral character. Since old Jean said so, he naturally believes that the kid would definitely not open that letter to peek. The principal smiled. I've never doubted old Jin's judgment. You actually let a student that old Jean set his eyes on be a janitor. Professor Zhou could not understand what these people were thinking. He scratched his head and prepared to leave. Just as he was about to open the door, he suddenly turned around and asked, "Can I not attend the Double Moon Festival dance? I don't know how to dance." No. The previously easygoing principal suddenly said resolutely, "This has always been a tradition of your university. Everyone has to attend." Looking at the tightly shut door, the corner of your university's principal's lips curled up slightly. He thought of that friend of his who had left for many years, old Jean. He said that he was going to visit the World Federation and even the Empire, but he did not know where he was now. It was just that such a good friend from back then disappeared just like that. Now that communication technology was so advanced, he actually had the heart to not even send an email greeting card. He was truly a heartless and shameless person. Although he was already an old man, when he thought of that friend who suddenly disappeared, he still felt a surge of anger in his heart. Fortunately, from that recommendation letter, he knew that the other party was still alive and well. He felt a trace of comfort. Following that, he thought of that dance during the Double Moon Festival. He thought of this tradition of Yue University from more than 20 years ago. It was also related to old Jean. At that dance, there was a beautiful story that happened. Moreover, the male and female leads of the story were both very important people. Even though he was a noble principal of a university, he could not help but feel a sense of pride. I wonder if Lady Tai will come to visit her family's young master. A trace of a gratified smile appeared on Yue University's face. Library Area H was not in the library. This was a very interesting thing. Sulu studied the small electronic card for a long time before finally thinking of using a computer to read the data on it. He found the building located in the most remote area of Yue University. This building was hidden in the boundless forest. There were no eye-catching signs around it. No matter who passed by, they would not notice this somewhat eerie building. With the electronic card in his hand, Sulu entered the building without any hindrance. He did not see any service staff along the way, so he could not help but feel a little puzzled. However, when he pushed open that large door, he saw a whole row of the latest processors and those large holographic screens that made people drool. He knew that he had entered a treasure trove. There were not many students who had the authority to enter Area H, but there were also quite a few of them. They only silently accessed the data on the central control computer, and then entered their own operating rooms or simulation rooms. They did not greet the newcomer Sulu. Sulu let out a sigh of relief. It looked like this was not a very special place. After spending an entire afternoon, he finally skimmed through all the data he could see on the terminal. Of course, he only had time to glance at the top few layers of the information tree. He did not have time to look at anything more detailed. But even so, it was enough to surprise him. He finally understood why there was a saying that Yue University was the most outstanding school in the entire Federation in terms of the three major systems of warship and mecha, excluding the three major military academies and the Westwoods Military Academy. He even found the blueprints of all the military mecha before the M37 series on the computer. The holographic screen flipped incessantly, and a somewhat familiar blueprint appeared. Looking at the internal structure of the M02, which looked like it had been stripped of its skin, Sulu finally could not help but open his mouth and laugh silently. Chapter 66. In the next few days, Sulu spent most of his time in Section H of the library. He forgot to sleep, forgot to eat, and devoted himself wholeheartedly to his interests. Of course, this was an exaggeration, but he really did not want to let go of any time he could spend in Section H. The information that had just been declassified by the military was, for someone like him, a great temptation. When he read through all the blueprints of the M series, especially after carefully analyzing the internal structure of the M02, he found that his actions back on the ancient bell had been so naive and whimsical. The mecha he had randomly assembled looked like it could move, but in reality, it hid endless dangers. Fortunately, that old mecha had only broken apart and did not explode. As Sulu studied, he corresponded with the days he spent with the boss uncle. Gradually, he began to understand some of the more vague principles. To become an excellent mechanical engineer, one had to be able to maintain a normal state of mind when faced with any kind of sophisticated equipment or mecha. However, one could not foolishly treat all the cutting-edge equipment as household appliances. After all, equipment like mecha, self-propelled cannons, and battleship transmission systems had to withstand an incomparably large load and the kinetic energy impact of an attack. They were not like household appliances, which could only operate leisurely in peace. Every detail, every quality of every electronic component, every choice of metal material, would affect their performance and even the lifespan of the operator. On the holographic screen, the partial structural diagram of the M02 mechanical leg was enlarged to the maximum. Within the faint blue light, Sulu opened his eyes and stared at it without blinking. He stared at the hydraulic tube hidden within the armor behind the mechanical leg. In the forest on the outskirts of Heshi, he had seen the uncle choose this spot as the breakthrough point for the attack mecha. He seriously analyzed it for a long time and finally confirmed that this hydraulic tube was indeed the weakest part of the M-series mecha. Of course, this weakness was relative. If it was a normal attack, even if it was a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher, most of the energy would be blocked by that layer of alloy armor. In order to avoid that hydraulic tube, an extremely precise angle and an attack method that could be bent, or a small weapon that could be inserted into the gap. After thinking about it, the only thing that could satisfy this. Sulu subconsciously looked at his own hands. Only now did he understand that the uncle's words back then were not wrong. Against those large mecha, it seemed that these two hands were the most effective weapon. However, if it were the hands of a normal person, a punch to the metal hydraulic tube would definitely result in broken bones and bleeding, and the tube would not even tremble. Unless that pair of hands possessed even greater strength and tighter bones and muscles. Sulu stared at his own hands, somewhat moved. He knew that he definitely would not be able to do this now, but the uncle could clearly do it easily. If he continued to practice that set of postures and experience that burning tremor, would he really be able to reach that level one day? The defensive power of the M-series mecha was extremely strong. Presumably, even with the terrifying strength of the mecha mechanic Fengyu, he would not be able to break through it head-on. However, things were always so strange. The mecha's seemingly perfect design had, in reality, only considered the attack of firearms, especially weapons of the same level. It had not considered that it would be attacked by humans, so it had left the hydraulic tube as a loophole. After all, the top mecha designers of the Federation would never have imagined that a monster like Feng Yu actually existed in this world. Because he was engrossed in the H section of the library, Su Lu rarely ate lunch with Zhang Xiaoming these past few days. He told the girl with the black-rimmed glasses, and Zhang Xiaoming nodded, clearly unconcerned. On the other hand, it was Shi Qinghai who was worried about Su Lu, who had not seen him in the sun for a few days. He finally managed to get in touch with him through the phone and found out about Su Li's recent whereabouts. Mr. Shi was clear about this friend's life goals and interests. As long as he remained on campus, his personal safety would not be threatened, so he did not ask further. Su Lu would only leave the H section at 7 or 8 p.m. every night. At this time, the outstanding students in the H section had already left. After all, they were still in the prime of their youth. No matter how hard they worked, no one would be willing to stay in such a cold and metallic place. Long periods of fatigue would not necessarily lead to good results. One night, Su Lu returned to his room. Looking at the pale green trees in the pear garden through the glass, he suddenly thought of what Uncle Feng Yu had done to the black M52 in the forest in the valley on the outskirts of Heshi region. How could those trembling hands control the mecha's movements from the outside? This was really too inexplicable. With this thought in mind, Su Lu found it difficult to sleep. Now that he had a deeper understanding of mecha, he also understood how precious that mysterious power within his body was. Naturally, he would no longer slack off on his training. Even if his mind was already extremely exhausted every night, he still persisted in finishing his training. After taking a shower, he sat on the edge of his bed and turned on the screen of his computer. He began to carefully calculate the theoretical possibilities of his strange conjecture. However, as he continued to calculate, he found that because he knew too little about the mysterious power, the trembling did not seem to have a fixed frequency. No matter how whimsical his conjecture was, it seemed to be difficult to prove it through experiments. But he still did not give up, because Uncle Feng Yu had once shown him that image. Countless symbols, parameters, blueprints, and words flashed through Su Li's mind. In the end, they became the image of Uncle Feng Yu's trembling hands falling on the black mecha like they were playing a piano. Tormented by these vague clues, Su Lu could not sleep at all. He sat up from his bed, put on a coat, turned on the automatic alarm system, and left the room. The campus at midnight was exceptionally quiet, especially in the forest where the library was located. The sound from the televisions in the student dormitories far away could not reach here at all. Su Lu used his electronic card to open the door to the library. He confirmed that the library was indeed open 24 hours a day, just as the information said. At this time, the library was already empty. Su Lu walked alone in the empty building. He watched as the sensor lights around him lit up with each step he took, but there was no fear in his heart. On one hand, it was because he was used to staying in the dark mines of Donglin since he was a child. On the other hand, his mind was currently completely occupied by the problem of the mecha and the power in his body. Flipping through the information on the holographic screen seriously, he did not gain anything. This was within Su Li's expectations. He was not too disappointed, only feeling a little tired. Rubbing his eyes, he began to walk around the quiet building. On one hand, it was to reduce some of his fatigue, and on the other hand, to move his body. Unknowingly, he had walked to the front of a corridor. On the wall beside the corridor was the word H1, and below it was an eye-catching nameplate. The general meaning was that the corridor was a restricted area. Those without the appropriate authority were not allowed to enter. Su Lu looked at the corridor curiously. He did not understand why Yue University's library, which was already a little strange, would have an H1 area within the library. Although he was curious, he did not have any intention of entering that area. This was because he could easily deduce that the authority to enter this H1 area could not be too low. It should be reserved for the school's professional researchers. He was just a normal student, how could he enter? He walked a few steps into the corridor, squinting his eyes to see what material the heavy door was made of. However, just as he was about 5 meters away from the door, the corridor suddenly lit up with a faint blue light. A low electronic voice sounded, signature symbol at the front of the information, please accept the AI chip scan to verify your identity. Su Lu was shocked by this sudden voice. He did not expect that he had not even touched the H1 area's door and had already activated the electronic monitoring program. He subconsciously wanted to leave the corridor, but his surroundings were already filled with layers of faint blue lines. It seemed that the AI chip scan had already begun. If he left now, would he be judged as an intruder by the electronic monitoring program? He stood in the middle of the scanning beam with slight fear, secretly praying that the scan would end quickly. As long as the electronic monitoring program judged that he did not have the authority to enter, the door would naturally not open, and he would be able to leave. Su Lu thought to himself that he should not be so curious in the future. It was just insomnia. How did it cause such a big commotion? The development of the situation did not develop as Su Lu expected. The scanning waveband that was supposed to be invisible was interestingly revealed by the designer to show light blue lines. Those lines finally gathered at the AI chip on the back of his neck, completing the scanning process. However, there was no warning sound to ask him to leave. Identity verified. Number confidential. Personal data confidential. The mechanical electronic voice became a little more lively at this moment. Welcome to H1 area. Su Lu looked at the door that retracted into the wall in surprise. At this time, he was naturally not in the mood to notice that this heavy door was made of alloy. He was just shocked that he was standing in the corridor and being scanned once, and his identity was verified. Could it be that in addition to giving him an electronic card, Professor Zhou also entered his personal information into the system? For the time being, he could not figure this out. Looking at the door at the end of the corridor that was shrouded in soft light, his strong curiosity overcame his caution, and he walked in. The heavy alloy door closed behind him. Su Lu looked around and found that the layout of the buildings in the H1 area was very simple. There was a small lounge with 2 rooms on each side. He habitually turned right and opened the door. Chapter 67. He was tired, his head was full of questions, and he was thirsty for sleep but unable to sleep because of the excitement. This was the most unbearable feeling. Su Lu rubbed his somewhat dry eyes and looked at the alloy mech at the end of the spacious room that was connected by countless cables. Suddenly, he no longer felt the mental torment from before. His eyes lit up as well. It was really beautiful. The surface of the pure black mech reflected a faint matte light, and the cables behind it that were connected to the various ports in the wall were painted in various colors according to the data or energy transmission. Some were white, some were red, some were blue. It was like a black ancient warrior with countless ribbons tied behind it, fluttering in the wind of the wasteland. Su Lu looked at this scene in admiration. He suddenly felt that there was no place in the world that was not beautiful. Even such cold metal and technology could still be pleasing to the eyes. After being stunned by the beauty of the mech, Su Lu gradually regained his senses and fell into a pleasant surprise. After all, this was the second time in his life that he had seen a real mech. Previously, the worn-out M02 on the ancient bell looked like trash. However, the mech hanging on the platform not far from him was so lively, as if it would come alive in the next moment. He carefully moved closer to the wall. Although he had already obtained permission to enter, he still could not suppress the nervousness and excitement in his heart when he suddenly saw a rarely seen mech appear in front of him. This was the prototype of the M-series mech. All weapons systems and cockpit doors were removed. Su Lu walked to the bottom of the mech and looked up at the mech that was glowing with a metallic light in midair. It was very easy for him to identify its model. In this spacious room, he found a terminal screen. He looked at it carefully and finally understood what this room was for. It turned out to be a mech control simulation room. Virtual training technology had been developed hundreds of years ago, but the problem was that it had not been fully developed. Today, it had not been promoted in the Federation. Sulu looked curiously at the instructions on the screen and found that this set of technology was the set of military technology that Sulu had been speculated on in the electronic magazine. Suli's interest in operating mecha in battle was far less than his interest in repairing and designing mecha. However, he was even more aware that an excellent mecha repair engineer would need to have an absolute understanding of the object they were researching. Furthermore, they would need to go through a long period of hands-on work to be able to make the fastest and most accurate judgments on those minute details. Lihua University provided such excellent training conditions for its students. It just so happened that he had a lot of doubts about the mysterious power in his body and the relationship between mecha operation. Naturally, he would not let go of such a good opportunity. Rubbing his somewhat cold hands and rubbing his somewhat red eyes, Sulu calmed the excitement in his heart. Following the M-series prototype mech's mechanical legs that were slightly thicker than two people, the designer had cleverly constructed a ladder-like armor around the legs to make this sort of climb not too difficult. Sulu sat in the control cabin and looked at the spacious space before him. A strange feeling grew in his heart. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the ergonomic touch screen on either side of his body. This type of touch screen was definitely different from the real mecha systems of the military. However, it should be more than enough to test and familiarize himself with the mech. The Black M-series prototype mech let out a sizzling sound the moment his hands were placed on it. An extremely thin screen slowly descended from the originally empty cockpit door, taking up all of Su Li's line of sight. It looked just like the kind one would see when wearing the helmet of reality. Please select your overall operation ability test level. Without hesitation, Sulu chose the lowest level test environment, level 6. Although Uncle Feng Yu and Li Wei had both praised him as a genius, and he sometimes also felt that he was a genius himself, that kind of talent seemed to be reflected in the level of mecha operation. He would not be so arrogant as to think that he would be able to emit the power of the stars and become the strongest mecha warrior in the Human Federation the first time he actually operated a mecha. There had never been anyone in this world who was born with knowledge, and Sulu admitted that he was not one of them. The level 6 mecha operation training test was indeed very simple. On the screen that took up all of his line of sight, all sorts of color patches and light rays constantly appeared. According to the instructions in the terminal, as long as it was a green color patch, he would need to perform a jump, while the black color patches would need to be destroyed. As for those light rays, they represented the energy emitted by the opponent's weapon. The only thing that was slightly more complicated was the control of the weapon system. This was because some color patches had a halo added to them, which meant that 2 to 5 consecutive hits would be required to destroy the target. The speed of the system test was very slow at the start, but as the number of targets the mecha could dodge or destroy increased, those color patches and light rays moving straight from the screen would gradually increase in speed. What made Su Li's head hurt even more was that there was no pattern to the appearance of those color patches and light rays. He could only rely on his own concentration and that pair of exceptionally calm eyes that had been immersed in the microscopic world for many years to judge. Sulu had never actually operated a mecha before. The instructions on the touch screen required him to experiment several times before he could remember the instructions for each operation. For such a novice, he only thought that being able to make the mecha move was already a very impressive feat. However, when he was struck by the light rays for the 34th time and heard the synthetic mechanical voice report that the mecha had been destroyed, he still could not help but feel endlessly gloomy. He held on for the first time, 1 second. The mecha's left mechanical leg tripped over the right mechanical leg, and the mecha successfully fell to the ground and self-destructed. He held on for the second time, 2 seconds. The mecha on the virtual screen struggled to lift its left leg, and was then pierced by a light ray. The transmission device on its left leg malfunctioned, and it was judged to have failed. He held on for the third time, 3 seconds. If this continued and he could hold on for one more second each time, perhaps Sulu, who was as tough as a rock, would not feel any sense of defeat. This was because he was like a blank piece of paper in this aspect to begin with. The problem was, when he finally managed to familiarize himself with all the commands and inputs, and was able to make this mecha hovering in mid-air move and move nimbly, he found that he was completely unable to avoid those obstacles and lights coming at him from the holographic screen. Those programmed obstacles and weapons came at him too quickly. He tried a total of 34 times, but the longest he could last was just a mere 5 seconds. Too crazy. Su Li's personality made it so that he would not find this sort of color-filled and light-filled test to be too boring. The Federation's virtual technology was already extremely rudimentary to begin with, so it was impossible for it to show him lifelike 3D images of city streets, alleys, buildings, or forests on the screen. However, he really could not stand this kind of continuous failure and the feeling of being unable to see any hope of improvement. This was only the lowest level test, and it was already so difficult. Sulu wiped away the sweat on his forehead, and in his heart, he could not help but feel endless admiration for those mecha warriors of the Federation military. As for that uncle who had successfully seized the mecha and walked around the mountainside like a demon, he felt that the other was like a tall mountain that he could not approach no matter how hard he tried. Motherfucker, motherfucker. Sulu would basically only swear in front of those closest to him. Most of the time, it was only when he felt defeated by being alone that he would say the words motherfucker. Moreover, every time he said the words motherfucker, it just so happened to be so proper and solemn. His words were articulate and powerful, as if he was saying, I love you, the Federation. The sweat on his forehead flowed out again after he wiped it away. He stared at the incomparably large failure on the screen, panting heavily, and let out a long, stuffy sigh. How could he increase his reaction speed and operation speed? There seemed to be a jargon in mecha operation called hand speed. Sulu stared blankly at his own 2 hands, having no intention of giving up. This was because the reason he had come to Area H today was to find out the relationship between the strength in his body and his mecha operation. Although he had experimented many times before, he had only lasted 8 seconds each time. However, he had still not actually tried out what he really needed to test. Closing his eyes, he thought back to those 10 postures. A faint warmth began to accumulate at the back of Su Li's waist. He carefully felt that warmth turn into a scorching heat, which then turned into a series of shivers on his skin. However, it was hidden under his clothes, so it did not show. Level 6 test begins. Those already incomparably familiar colored blocks and rays of light surged in from all directions on the screen, leaving very little reaction time and space for the mecha which appeared in the virtual world from a first-person perspective. Su Li's hands moved rapidly across the screen, entering command after command. Only he knew that the current situation had already undergone some very subtle changes compared to before. When those colored blocks and rays of light entered his eyes, his brain reacted in the shortest amount of time. However, the commands his brain sent to his fingertips no longer seemed to be transmitted through the nerve bundles in his body. Instead, the right to bear the weight of the commands was subconsciously snatched away by that warm current and trembling in his body. Improvement, 11. 7 seconds. Sulu leaned limply against his seat in the cockpit, his entire body drenched in sweat. In his full concentration, he had not even noticed the abnormality in his body earlier. To be honest, those microscopic changes were indeed not something that could be observed by humans themselves. They could only be seen in the results. His stomach growled, and an irrepressible feeling of hunger appeared. Sulu licked his dry lips. He was already used to this phenomenon. Every time that familiar trembling appeared, he would feel incomparably tired and hungry. He did not leave, continuing to attempt what only one person in the history of the Federation had ever done. However, he did not improve after that. His best result was still stuck at the extremely pitiful figure of 11. 7 seconds. Finally, one time, in his intense depression, Sulu could not control that trace of trembling from his fingertips. With a cracking sound, the two intricate and expensive touch control screens shattered into countless components and screen fragments. He stared blankly at these fragments under his hands. Suddenly, he came to his senses. Who knew how many credits would be deducted for destroying such intricate equipment in the school? Suppressing his fatigue and hunger, he climbed down from the M prototype and cleaned up the fragments inside. Then, like a thief, he quietly slipped out of the room. Leaving the room, Sulu was somewhat surprised to find a cup of steaming hot coffee and a few plates of snacks on the coffee table in Area H1's lounge. He swallowed. It was already late at night, and there was no place to eat. He really could not suppress the hunger in his stomach. He carefully looked around to confirm that there was no one around, and then walked over. Chapter 68. Library Area H was the most secluded and secretive building in Lihua University. Behind this building, surrounded by the lake and the dense forest, there was an exceptionally quiet little villa. Without the permission of the school and the owner of the villa, perhaps no one would be able to see this little villa. Young master, the coffee and your favorite caviar are ready. Uncle Jean, who was wearing a butler's uniform, bowed slightly and said calmly to the young man on the sofa, "However, I still strongly recommend that you adjust your daily schedule. Although the outside world vaguely knows that you live in the university town, there is no need to hide your identity and go out at night. It's not good for your health." The young man on the sofa put down the documents in his hands and fell silent for a moment. Butler Jean was one of the most trusted people in the family. He had only met this butler after he graduated from the capital university. After a few attempts, he knew that he couldn't make the butler give up the title of young master, so he gave up. However, there was no way around it. Tai Ziyuan didn't have anyone in the Federation that he was afraid of. He was just habitually suffering from insomnia. This bad habit started when he was 11 years old, and there was no way to cure it. He knew very well that insomnia was due to pressure. The endless pressure that had surrounded him since he was a child. The young man's face was slightly pale. He stood up from the sofa and said to Butler Jean, "I'm used to it." Butler Jean bowed respectfully to the young man walking out of the villa, but he was thinking about his young master's pale face. After a few months of working together, he of course knew about his young master's insomnia problem. However, he couldn't solve it because, as the most loyal servants of the Tai family, he knew that his young master would have to bear the pressure in his life in the future. Every citizen of the Federation knew that there were 7 families in the Federation, but they seemed to have forgotten that, a long time ago, there was only one family in the Federation that stood proudly above the masses, the Tai family. 37 constitutional years ago, the last emperor of the Tai family ended his family's rule with a smile, and then began to retreat into the shadows of history. No matter how history was written, the citizens of the Federation were grateful to the faraway Tai family. They made the greatest sacrifice and the wisest choice for the Federation to develop towards democracy and freedom. No one knew what kind of power the Tai family, who had once controlled the wealth and power of the entire human society, still had after so many years. This was something that even the other 6 of the 7 great families were not fully aware of. However, no one had ever dared to show disrespect to the Tai family. As the sole heir of the Tai family for 7 generations, the young master was only a 17-year-old boy. How could he bear such a huge burden? When Butler Jean thought of his wife's prediction of the future development of the Federation, he couldn't help but feel a tinge of heartache for the pale-faced young man. However, he immediately knew that he shouldn't reveal such a feeling of closeness, as it would be disrespectful to his master. He walked to the side of the sofa and began to organize the documents that the young master had finished reading today. Then, he put the paper documents into the furnace and burned them, leaving no trace behind. The flames swallowed up the documents that Tai Ziyuan had read earlier. On the white papers, it was recorded that the anti-government leader had secretly arrived at the capital city on a special plane and had begun his campaign for the Federation's parliament. The entire Federation would only know about this news tomorrow night. There was also a white paper that recorded that Senator Pabre, who was born in the Donglin district, had solemnly expressed at a small gathering of his close friends that he had some thoughts about the next year's presidential election. Most 17-year-old boys read comics or novels. Only the descendants of the Tai family would read such things. With such a life, it was difficult not to lose sleep. There was a secret passageway by the lakeside that led directly to the mysterious H1 area behind the H section of Yue University's library. Tai Ziyuan stood silently in the middle of the corridor. After passing through the scanning of the light blue light and entering through the alloy door, he habitually chose the room on the right and pushed open the door to enter. This descendant of the mysterious Tai family, who was constantly sought out by various forces and was known as the Crown Prince, did not need to worry about his safety. This was because only he and butler Jean had access to this area. Even the principal did not have access. There were no surveillance cameras here, and the special task force agents did not need to follow him in. His status naturally did not require him to work hard like a successful mecha warrior or mechanic. However, he still entered H1 on time every night to carry out those boring exercises. This was because the previous head of the Tai family, the young boy's father, had relayed a certain person's words more than once when he was still alive. Mechas are basically a type of flashy but useless waste, except for special operations. However, the process of trying to use the human body to control a huge machine could temper a person's will and change a person's temperament. For Tai Ziyuan, who had an incomparably noble status, there was another reason why he came to H1 every night. Every time he was tired and sweaty in the laboratory, he always felt a kind of carefree feeling. After drinking a cup of hot coffee and eating 2 pieces of snacks, he was barely able to fall into an extremely poor sleep. The passageway from H1 to the lakeside villa and the passageway from H section of the library were 2 completely opposite directions. Tai Ziyuan turned right. Su Lu, who came in first, also turned right. The 2 of them happened to enter 2 rooms that were opposite each other. After a while, the door of the other room opened. Su Lu walked out and stared blankly at the hot coffee on the thermostat in the lounge. His stomach growled twice. Su Lu left. H1 was still quiet. After a while, Tai Ziyuan, who looked even more tired but whose face had a few traces of red, walked out of the room. He had a sweat-soaked shirt on his elbow. The young man's facial features were distinct. Although he could not be said to be heroic, a trace of satisfaction flashed across his face that left a deep impression. He had finally passed level 3 today. Although it took him a whole half a month, the sense of accomplishment did not seem to be weaker than every success he had had in the past few years. There were no surveillance cameras here, nor were there any family servants. After being stunned for a while, Tai Ziyuan suddenly shouted at the empty building, as if he was venting something. However, it was obvious that he rarely did such things. The shouting stopped abruptly. After a slight embarrassment, his face returned to its usual indifference and calmness. Tai Ziyuan habitually walked to the lounge and sat on a chair. He habitually reached out his right hand, picked up the cup of hot coffee, and took a sip. There was nothing in the cup. Tai Ziyuan's pupils suddenly shrank. Only then did he feel that the cup was much lighter than usual. From the corner of his eye, he saw that a few pieces of the caviar on the plate were missing, and there were some food remnants on the table. Vigilantly, he stood up and scanned the entire H1 area as quickly as he could. He then pressed a button on the pager. As long as he pressed the button, Butler Jean would bring the Special Task Force's special agents over to ensure his safety. However, Tai Ziyuan did not press the pager because he noticed a piece of paper on the table beside him. Usually, he would leave notes for Butler Jean here, so he prepared a pen and a stack of white paper. However, the handwriting on the paper today was obviously not his, nor was it Butler Jin's. Tai Ziyuan frowned. He picked up the clothes that had been thrown at his feet and wrapped his fingers. He picked up the paper. "I'm very sorry. I was too hungry after the practice and took your food without asking. Although I don't know who you are and whether you still want to eat, I'm really sorry. By the way, that plate of pastries seems to be spoiled. They taste weird. I'll bring you something good to eat tomorrow night as an apology. I hope you won't be angry. Tai Ziyuan put down the paper and suddenly turned to walk to another room. He pushed open the door and walked to the terminal screen. He found a bag of trash behind the screen, which seemed to be a fragment of the screen. He was even more confused about what had happened. He turned on the terminal screen curiously to see what the person who had entered before had done. Level 6. 7 seconds. What an idiot. Tai Ziyuan gave a fair evaluation without holding back. Looking at the input speed of the computer, this person was obviously a newbie. Why would he want to challenge level 6, which was the most difficult level? It seemed that this person really didn't know anything. Although Tai Ziyuan could hold on for half a minute if he challenged level 6, he definitely wouldn't try a second time. This was because the level 6 test time was 20 minutes long, and the speed would increase with each passing minute. Only the best of the best in the Federation or the Empire would be able to pass. No, even the strongest mecha warrior in the Federation or the Empire wouldn't be able to pass level 6. Tai Ziyuan's expression darkened as he turned off the terminal screen. He was filled with endless anger towards that idiot intruder. Drinking his favorite Gata coffee, eating his favorite Caspian caviar, and saying that his biscuits were spoiled. Tai Ziyuan quickly walked back to the lounge. After a moment of silence, he picked up the pen and habitually wrote his reply at the bottom of the white paper. Read. Young master, I didn't know that the principal was attending a meeting at the Ministry of Education. It seems that the First Military Academy is preparing to visit Linhai University town. I'll definitely make him give an explanation. Butler Jean lowered his head to hide his nervousness. He felt a lingering fear whenever he thought about how the young master had actually spent tens of minutes alone with an intruder in H1. The test results for the coffee cup and caviar are out. There's no poison. There's also no problem with the pen and paper. Have you found out the identity of the intruder? Under the afternoon sun, Tai Ziyuan, who had just woken up, seemed to be in better spirits than usual. He tried to ask as calmly as possible. Chapter 69. H1 Central Control Computer strangely gave the answer that the information was confidential. However, after accessing the school's surveillance equipment, the Special Task Force found out that this person was called Sulu. Butler Jean continued, and according to the results of the family investigation, this person entered Yue University last year because Professor Jean recommended him. Professor Jean, the designer of H1. Tai Ziyuan was slightly taken aback and asked, so it was him. No wonder that student could enter H1. Does that student know my identity? He didn't know that the principal was a cautious person. This kind of problem shouldn't have occurred. When mentioning the principal of Yue University, there was not much respect in Butler Jin's tone. Tai Ziyuan was silent for a moment. He thought about the intruder who had eaten his caviar last night. He thought about the trespasser's extremely lackluster taste, and especially about that empty coffee cup. He had indirectly touched that person's mouth. Tai Ziyuan felt extremely angry in his heart, but he did not reveal any of it on his face. He calmly mocked, cautious. I don't see it. Tai Ziyuan did not care about the principal of Yue University. He did not even respect the designer of H1. It was only because his parents used to know each other in this university, and because his parents had a good relationship with the principal and Professor Jean that he did not show too much indifference in front of Butler Jean. He did not know that the principal had gone to the special regional capital to participate in an impromptu meeting with the Ministry of Education. The problem of the intruder could not be dealt with properly for the time being. Tai Ziyuan suddenly remembered what Butler Jean had just said. The First Military Academy was visiting Yue University. He frowned. He smelled a hint of flattery that he did not like. The Tai family had been at the top of human society for too long. It was so long that Tai Ziyuan sometimes could not remember the history of the family clearly. 37 constitutional years ago, the Tai family had ended their rule over human society. Since then, no matter how the political system changed, until the Federation was established 600 years ago, they had always maintained certain very important traditions. Similar to the traditions of these great families, the major military academies of the Federation had actually appeared before the recent Federation system. Since ancient times, the descendants of the Tai family had all studied at the first military academy. This was a tradition that was recognized by both sides. The only exception was the previous Tai family head 20 years ago. Unexpectedly, he chose Yue University. Because the previous head of the Tai family, Tai Ziyuan's father, was a person with a strong literary background, and had no interest in political, military, and economic matters. He had been very little in his life when he was alive, so the first was shocked and disappointed, but also reluctantly accepted this reality. The problem was, now that the future head of the Tai family had once again started to study and experience human society, he had once again given up on the first military academy and chose Yue University. This made the elders of the first military academy feel humiliated. They did not understand what the high and mighty Tai family was thinking. Presumably, the upcoming visit had something to do with Tai Ziyuan, who was hiding in Yue University. Butler Jean saw that the young master was deep in thought, and very keenly guessed what he was thinking. He softly explained, "We haven't found out where the first military academy got the news from yet. It's possible that they guessed it. After all, there are many powerful people in the first military academy. Back then, they watched with their own eyes as their father chose Yue University. How could they not remember this kind of humiliation?" Tai Ziyuan calmly said, "Since Zhou Yu and Yuzi know that I'm in Yue University, there shouldn't be many people in the Federation who don't know. Zhou Yingxing is too much. That pair of siblings came to Linhai a few months ago, and it's said that they caused some trouble in the city. Young master, do you think we should warn the Ministry of National Defense?" Butler Jean was only a butler of the Tai family, but other than in front of the madam and the young master, he would act like a noble in a novel, no matter who it was in front of, in the Federation government. Warning sounded like a gentle word, but if this word came from the Tai family, it represented an extremely strong pressure and action. It was possible that many people would lose their future because of this, or even, lose their lives. Tai Ziyuan quietly looked at Butler Jean, his calm eyes hiding a deep sense of pressure. He said word by word, "Don't forget, the era of imperial power has already passed 37,000 years ago. The Federation today is a society ruled by law. I am only a descendant of the Tai family, and I can't really be the crown prince. I don't want to warn you again, but the glory of the past can't come back, and you shouldn't think like that. Besides, in my opinion, that glory is nothing but shame and sin. History can't be reversed, at least not in my hands." Tai Ziyuan put down the information about the intruder called Su Lu and narrowed his eyes to warn his butler. The reason why he gave such a serious warning was because he knew that if he expressed his opinion about certain things or people, the Tai family's terrifying influence throughout the Federation would come into play, and he didn't want that to happen. This was especially true for the Zhou family siblings. Although he didn't consider them his friends, they had accompanied him when he was young, and they had always treated him with respect. He didn't want them to attract any trouble just because they wanted to get close to him. Moreover, his mother seemed to have casually said after dinner that Zhou Yu looked like a girl with a buttocks and should be easy to bear. Although Tai Ziyuan was very uncomfortable with his mother's tone, he also knew that if Yuzi had become one of the possible targets in his mother's eyes, then there would be a lot of trouble if Butler Jean secretly did something for him. "Keep what happened last night a secret." Tai Ziyuan tapped the information about Su Lu lightly with his fingertips and said in a serious tone, "Don't let my family know. I don't want my mother to worry about such trivial matters." Butler Jean hesitated for a moment before agreeing, then said, "Young master, you can't enter Area H1 before you revoke the access rights of that student called Su Lu. You don't have to worry about me. Since he's a student recommended by Professor Jean, I don't think my mother will be worried even if she knows." Tai Ziyuan said, "Tell those special task force agents to stay away as well. I'm having trouble breathing if they keep following me around. I'm a prisoner in this villa anyway, but I can't always be watched by the guards." The special task force agents are Mr. President's goodwill to Madam. Before Butler Jean could finish, Tai Ziyuan frowned. Khufu, that idiot, is definitely going to step down next year. Does he expect my mother to help him stay in office? President Khufu isn't that ambitious. He only hopes to enter the Golden Foundation after he steps down. Butler Jean took over the topic naturally and said seriously, "Madam will meet with Councilman Pabre tomorrow to discuss matters regarding next year's election. Pabre is someone that both my mother and I admire very much." Tai Ziyuan was silent for a moment before saying, "But the more you admire him, the more disappointed my mother will be. How could an upright and outstanding politician be willing to be influenced by those families and tycoons? Perhaps Madam will offer a very attractive price. Then both parties can only reach some kind of compromise at most." Tai Ziyuan didn't want to think about these troublesome things that a 17-year-old teenager shouldn't be thinking about, so he walked up to the bedroom on the second floor. The sky outside was gradually darkening. After resting for a while, he prepared to enter H1 as usual. He didn't want his mother to know about this matter. Firstly, he needed some privacy and freedom of his own. Secondly, he subconsciously didn't want his mother to know that Professor Jean was still alive. As for Su Lu, he didn't care about him at all. In the eyes of this noble young master, that intruder was just an extremely lucky retired soldier who had an extremely disgusting taste in life. Perhaps, he was a little interesting. Tai Ziyuan, who was going upstairs, had a mischievous smile on his face. The most expensive food Su Lu had ever eaten in his life was probably the buffalo he had slaughtered with his own hands. Of course, he couldn't say that he had high taste in life. The precious Caspian Sea caviar on his tongue was just a very disgusting taste, like the taste of rotten salted egg yolks. Moreover, the size of the caviar made it even more disgusting. His taste buds were completely unable to adapt to those small explosions, which was why he had reminded that classmate on the paper, "Your biscuits seem to have gone bad." That night, Su Lu still couldn't sleep. His experiment in H1 had ended in failure. When he used the mysterious power in his body to operate the mecha, he didn't show the same level of strength as the uncle. He wasn't sure if it was because of his own ability, or if he had taken the wrong path. However, that small possibility still kept him thinking and excited. He kept thinking, if it weren't for the fact that his fingertips were trembling so violently that they destroyed the two control screens, would he really have discovered something wonderful? Besides that, what he thought about the most was that he had secretly eaten someone else's supper last night. He felt very ashamed, because taking without asking was considered stealing. Although he had brought Li Wei to steal from the cafe owner before, he had returned it that very night. Su Lu decided to bring some supper to that classmate today as compensation. He just didn't know if the other party would still be staying up late tonight. What he wanted to experiment was the relationship between mecha control and the power in his body. That mysterious trembling in his body definitely couldn't be known to anyone else. For safety reasons, Su Lu might enter H1 during the day and wait in the gatehouse until late at night when no one spoke. Only then would he carry that slightly whitened backpack and head to a remote area of Pear Blossom University in the dark. Before entering the room on the right, Su Lu first walked into the lounge. Seeing the large study character on the paper, he couldn't help but laugh out loud, thinking to himself that this classmate was quite an interesting person. Seeing that the table was still filled with hot coffee and biscuits, Su Lu quickly averted his gaze. He was really choking on these biscuits. Putting down the bag of soy milk and deep-fried dough cake, Su Lu glanced at the tightly shut door, and then walked into his own room. Chapter 70. His backpack was stuffed full of small self-powered repair tools, a large number of components, and standard high-intensity holographic screen chips. All of these things had been ordered online, costing Su Lu more than 10,000 yuan. Fortunately, the logistics industry of the Federation was exceptionally developed nowadays, and these things were not controlled goods. Without wasting any time, he prepared to fix the 2 holographic screens he had broken last night. However, when he walked behind the holographic screen terminals, he found that the holographic screen fragments he had carefully piled up were already gone. Putting down the heavy backpack in surprise, Sulu scratched his head and climbed up the gangway ladder to the M-prototype mecha's operation cabin. He was rather happy to find the 2 holographic screens beside his hands. Currently in an extremely good mood, he could not help but feel even more grateful towards UA University, but what he did not know was that these 2 holographic screens had been replaced by Butler Jean, who was in charge of the cleanup of Area H1. Although Butler Jean was always the only person by the side of the young master of the Tai family, in reality, this personal butler led 5 small teams, numbering as many as 60 professionals, to provide comprehensive service to Tai Ziyuan alone. Replacing 2 holographic screens within a single day was truly too easy a task. Sulu naturally could not have guessed that he was basking in the glory of an important person, enjoying the highest level of logistics service of the Federation. At this time, he was already seated in the operation cabin, beginning his level 6 training. However, tonight, he was exceptionally careful, consciously controlling the intensity of the trembling or heat flow in his body. Very strange, truly very strange. Faced with the increasing speed of light and color on the holographic screens, Su Li's eyes did not blink, engraving all of it into his mind. Then, with a single thought, a channel seemed to suddenly appear in the muscles and nerves of his body, and the trembling or heat flow would follow that channel, faithfully and rapidly transmitting his thoughts to his fingertips. From there, they would move rapidly across the holographic screens, entering command after command. However, it was still embarrassing. His best time of 11.8 seconds was 0.1 seconds better than last night's. Could this even be considered improvement? Drenched in sweat, Sulu sat limply in his seat, sweat dripping down from his wet black hair. His fingers were trembling uncontrollably from overexertion. This trembling was purely a side effect of exhaustion, and there was nothing strange about it at all. Sulu sat thoughtfully in the belly of the mecha's operation cabin, recalling the uncle's every move in the valley, his fingers imitating those movements he had seen before. Suddenly, he stood up and looked from the side of the mecha's compartment, and could not help but whistle. It looked like there were indeed some differences between the blueprints and reality. Although those data wiring and sensor devices were indeed under the mecha's protection, they were not isolated from the alloy mecha's controls. Vaguely, Sulu had a general understanding of how Uncle Feng Yu's pair of magical hands had been able to control the mecha's movements just from the surface of the mecha. It was probably the trembling in the body that could leave the human body to form some sort of electrical current or data flow, passing through the surface of the alloy mecha to enter the mecha's data transmission lines. This was a whimsical idea. The human body was not a generator, nor was it a sensor. How could it possibly use electrical current or data flow to communicate with a machine? But other than that, Sulu really had no way of explaining the ability the uncle had once displayed. Sulu sat back down in his chair, once again sinking into a long period of thought. If he wanted to prove his conjecture, prove that the trembling in the body could be converted into a fixed frequency wave under certain circumstances, and even be able to control mecha, then he would need to enter the Federation's top laboratories. A year had already passed. The trembling in Su Li's body that could suddenly erupt with tremendous power had already seeped under his skin, no longer attracting attention. Instead, it had become some sort of slightly numbing heat flow, circulating endlessly along a certain channel in his body, but this had little to do with him operating the touch screen, unless he could get his hands on a mecha full-body sensor control console that had long since been phased out. Sulu wiped away the sweat on his forehead, enjoying the clean breeze that continuously flowed in from around the control console. It was said that the current M52 series was even more comfortable to control, but he was already very satisfied. In the cool breeze, he stared blankly at his slightly trembling hands. He did not know how to release that heat flow from his body beyond his skin, much less use this power to control the 3 major systems of his mecha. But no matter how slow a person was, at this time, he would know that the 10 movements that Uncle Boss had taught him back then were a kind of mysterious and powerful ability. He stared blankly at his hands and suddenly felt afraid. He felt that if this continued, he was afraid that he would no longer be himself, but would become a machine. But he didn't know whether it was a killing machine or something else. But so what if he was afraid? That intense curiosity and thirst for the unknown continued to spur him on. He continued to fumble around on this path without a teacher, completely forgetting his original intention of only wanting to repair Mecha. More and more, he sank deeper and deeper into the endless boundaries of Mecha and his own body. What did the Uncle Boss mean when he said the number 1 machine back then? Exhausted but energized, Sulu walked out of the room. A whole new world had already opened up before him. His mind was filled with an excitement that did not match the fatigue of his body at all. Faced with this kind of mysterious and unknown world, perhaps some people would be afraid, and some would avoid it. But for Sulu, he only excitedly waited for what might happen in the future. The door of the opposite room was still tightly shut. The excellent soundproofing of Area H1 was silent. Only the green light beside the door indicated that there was someone inside. From the hot coffee and spoiled biscuits in the lounge, Sulu knew that this unknown companion was the same person from last night. He looked curiously at the door, thinking to himself that it was already so late. Other than himself, there was actually someone else who could not sleep for 2 consecutive nights. It was because his mind was always occupied by those strange and incomprehensible things. Where was the person inside? His growling stomach reminded him that he was in a state of extreme hunger. Sulu walked into the lounge with a bitter face, wolfing down his soy milk and youtiao. Then he began to look at the soy milk and youtiao that he originally brought for that person with green eyes. At this time, Sulu had already confirmed that every time he used the trembling power in his body, he would fall into a state of hunger. It was like this when he broke the plastic rope to escape in Donglin district, and it was also like this when he practiced in the gatehouse every night. Especially after 2 nights of repetitive and boring high-intensity training in Area H1, his spirit was stretched to the extreme, and his hunger had reached an unprecedented level. This little bit of soy milk and youtiao was really not enough to fill his stomach. He muttered a few words in a low voice, as if he was apologizing to the air. Then he picked up a piece of youtiao cake and swallowed it quickly. But he was still not satisfied. He stared at the little food on the table, pursed his lips, and smiled embarrassedly. He quietly picked up the cup of coffee. The coffee was gone, but the caviar was still there. That tasteless person really came. Tai Ziyuan, who was sweating all over, stared at the table in the lounge unhappily. He saw the soy milk and a piece of greasy paste in the paper bag that gave him a headache. He picked up the paper and saw that there was handwriting on it again. "I'm sorry, I didn't bring enough food today. I'm really hungry, so I only left you a piece of deep-fried dough cake and drank your coffee. But it seems that you have been suffering from insomnia recently. It's better to drink less coffee, hee. Tai Ziyuan looked at the last 2 words on the note, and a smirking face seemed to flash in front of his eyes. He should have been angry, but he didn't know why he smiled bitterly instead. Tai Ziyuan took out the soy milk and the youtiao cake from the paper bag. Suddenly, he was lost in thought. If it was someone who wanted to harm him, they could put ordinary food for more than 20 days, and randomly choose a day to put poison. As long as they could make him lose his vigilance, what couldn't they do? He silently looked at the soy milk and the thing called the youtiao cake in his hand. Suddenly, a fierce expression flashed across his face, as if he had decided to take the most dangerous gamble in his life. He frowned and drank the soy milk as if he was drinking poison. Then, he ate the deep-fried dough cake and sat on the chair in the lounge. He was in a daze for a long time. After a long time, he whispered to himself, "Deep-fried dough cake. It seems to taste okay." Suddenly, Tai Ziyuan lost interest in his favorite caviar cake. His eyes flashed with a trace of gentleness. After thinking for a while, he picked up the pen and wrote his reply on the paper. Stingy. After finishing this action, which even he felt was incomparably childish, Tai Ziyuan subconsciously walked to the room and began to look at Su Li's training data. Even he didn't know why he was so interested in this intruder. As expected, the duration of level 6 was still around 11 seconds. Tai Ziyuan thought sarcastically that this guy was really an idiot. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, his eyebrows furrowed. He had a feeling that the rows of data didn't seem to match up. Young master, the results of Hospital 1 are out. Butler Jean looked at Tai Ziyuan with some concern. He was in charge of cleaning up area H1, so he naturally knew the handwriting left on the white paper. However, without the young master's permission, he didn't dare to touch it. He lowered his head and reported, after the laboratory there identified these data, they believe that these data were fabricated. Fabricated? Tai Ziyuan turned off the TV on the wall and frowned. He didn't understand what was going on. It was obviously that idiot's training data, so why did the experts of First Military Academy come to the conclusion that it was fabricated? Chapter 71. Young Master, the First Military Academy did not know that it was your test data. Housekeeper Jean did not understand the situation. He subconsciously thought that the young master had tampered with his data, but he could not guess the young master's intentions. Could it be that the young master was unhappy with the First Military Academy sending a representative team to visit Yue University, disturbing his peace? Maybe there was a problem with the sampling. Tai Ziyuan naturally would not admit his childish actions to his subordinates and servants. He lowered his head to look at the analysis report on Su Li's test data, treating it as a way to relax under the heavy pressure he was under every day. The more he looked, the stranger he felt. The experts of the First Military Academy naturally would not make a mistake in their judgment. Those densely packed data were indeed a little strange, but it was consistent with his intuition from that night. In Su Li's test data, the effective command input speed, excluding the redundant data, was 76 seconds on average, with the highest peak being 139 seconds. In other words, within each standard period of time, Su Li could only input around 100 effective commands into the mecha. Even if these effective commands were all correct countermeasures, at such a low speed, it was still impossible for the mecha to last 7 seconds in the level 6 test. At most, it would fail after 7 seconds. There was indeed a problem with the data indicated on the paper. Tai Ziyuan curiously looked through it carefully. His own command input speed was about 4 times that of the other party, and the other party was indeed a beginner. Using the analysis of the First Military Academy, to complete the dodging and attacking movements of the mecha with this kind of input speed, the experimenter's neural reaction speed must be unbelievably high. 0.0012. Seeing this calculated number, Tai Ziyuan could not help but doubt the reliability of Su Li's test data. The most important thing in operating a mecha was the reaction speed of the operator. The mecha's own detection equipment would scan the terrain and environment, and any hostile targets or obstacles would appear on the operator's visual display. Those light icons and data were read by the human eye and entered into the brain for analysis. Then, the brain would send out instructions, which would be transmitted to the hands via nerve bundles. Then, the operation instructions would be inputted into the touch screen, and the mecha would perform the corresponding actions according to the instructions. This was a complete process, and no one would be able to omit every step of the process. After training, the reaction speed of the human body might become much faster than that of the average person, such as those top-notch special mecha operators of the Federation or the Empire. However, due to the limitations of one's physiological foundation, it was impossible for one to reach such an inconceivable level. This reaction speed was practically zero, and from the analysis of data and the various aspects of mecha combat, the only aspect that could reduce one's reaction time was the time between the brain issuing the command and the hands inputting the command. Science had long since proven that the human brain's neural processing and reaction speed was about 300 meters per second, the response speed was about 126th of a second, and the transmission speed of information in the bundle of nerves was 120 meters per second. However, Su Li's neural reaction speed, or the transmission speed within the nerve bundle, was far beyond this value. No wonder the experts in the first military academy's laboratory had thought that there was a problem with this data. If information could be transmitted so quickly in the human body, then that could only mean that the person was not human. Tai Ziyuan shook his head and set the data aside. Since there was a problem with the data, he had no interest in paying any more attention to that idiot. He was also not worried about whether some expert from some faction had disguised himself as a novice to get close to him. This was because an impersonator could only pretend to have a slower reaction speed, not create such a ridiculous neural reaction speed out of thin air. Right, Uncle Jean, tonight, prepare a pot of coffee. Tai Ziyuan suddenly thought of something very important. Frowning, he said, 2 cups. Su Lu did indeed have nerves that were much stronger than the average person's. If it had been someone else, when they were young and found out that their boss was a fugitive from the military, they would have definitely fled the control room or the repair shop long ago and reported it to the government, trembling all over. However, Su Lu did not. If it had been someone else, if they were caught by the military special forces and had several black muzzles pointed at them, they would definitely be scared to the point of peeing their pants and telling the government about Uncle Jin's whereabouts. However, Su Lu did not do so. If it had been someone else, when they found out that the glory of the charter throughout the Federation couldn't shine on them, and when they found out that they could implant a new chip into the back of their neck, they would definitely be scared witless. However, Su Lu still did not do so. Perhaps it was because he had seen too many strange things in his short 18 years of life, so when he found out that the mysterious power in his body seemed to be more mysterious than he had imagined, he did not panic or feel uneasy at all. Instead, he felt a faint sense of excitement and desire. It was not a desire for power, but a desire for the unknown. He only knew all of this, accepted all of this, and bravely faced all of this. Furthermore, he faced all of this with such optimism. Even though he was still a fugitive from society, he was still happily and healthily working, studying, and living in Yale University. He had friends, female friends, a study partner that he never saw every night, and something that he was most interested in, something that he was willing to sacrifice his sweat and time for. Of course, this was to describe Su Li's personality. It had nothing to do with the conclusion that the first military academy came up with after reviewing the data from Area H1. Su Lu knew that in this world, there were already people who had studied his nerves and thought that the data was very crazy. If he were to examine the data himself, he could easily come up with the most realistic conclusion. In this world, there was no one whose nerve reaction and transmission speed was fast enough to catch up with the sun. Su Lu could, and Feng Yu could not. The reason why his pathetically slow hand speed could exceed the speed of the screen was because when the light and color on the screen entered his eyes and was calculated in his brain, they were not transmitted to his hands through the nerve bundles of the spinal column and the nerve cells. After the brain made the calculation, the reaction should be following the path of the strange tremors and heat flow in his body. If the nerve bundles in the human body were the widest 12-lane highway in the outskirts of the Capital Special District, then the path in Su Li's body that could not be found in an autopsy was like the established space path between galaxies. There was no end, only direction, no speed limit, only vastness. In the following few nights of learning and experimentation, Su Lu also gradually experienced the beauty of this strange control method. He was so engrossed in it that he could not extricate himself. At level 6, his endurance time also grew longer and longer, from 11.8 seconds to 17 seconds. Other than the constant battle with the M prototype mecha, Su Lu also had one more thing on his mind these past few days. He found that the classmate next door seemed to have the same insomnia problem as himself. Although they had not met yet, the two of them seemed to be separated by a corridor, communicating through the supper. Later on, Sulu prepared ample portions of food, such as scallion pancakes and roasted sweet potatoes. These natural foods were actually not easy to find these days, and they were not cheap either. However, Sulu had been having extra meals every night for the past 6 months. He never got tired of looking for supper and was very familiar with it, so there was not a single night where he had the same meal. Tonight, he had brought over roasted lamb chops. Of course, it was synthetic mutton. Looking at the pot of coffee and the pitifully small plate of biscuits in the lounge, he could not help but smile. He thought to himself, that person called me a stingy person, but in fact, I am the stingy one. How can I have enough biscuits with so little? Later on, he finally discovered the strangeness of those caviar biscuits and also knew how expensive they were, but he still did not like them. Sulu very naturally poured himself a cup of hot coffee, and then hummed the theme song of Channel 23's longevity drama as he sashayed into his room. He and Tai Ziyuan, whose name he did not know, seemed to have some kind of tacit understanding. After the two of them entered area H1, they would always turn right, never left, and never disturb each other. Sulu was already used to this kind of night. He sat on the M-series prototype and began to concentrate on his practice. Occasionally, in between practice, he would lift his feet up and rest on the alloy frame by the cockpit door. He would drink his hot coffee while looking at the high ceiling and thinking about random things. For example, he was thinking today. If he could find a complete simulation system and connect the sensors directly to the surface of his skin, would it allow the mech to operate faster? This was just a thought. Those systems that were judged to have no future had been eliminated decades ago. Sulu was quite lucky to have seen one in the garbage hold of the ancient clock, but where could he find one in this university? A sudden voice in the cockpit woke Sulu from his thoughts. The cup of coffee in his hand almost fell to the ground a few meters away. Is the coffee good? An emotionless voice came from the speaker in the cockpit. Sulu was stunned for a long time before he reacted. He had been in H1 for many nights and had not heard or seen anyone other than himself. He had not heard any other voice. He looked at the light screen prompt and confirmed that it was an internal call from H1. He immediately guessed who the voice belonged to. He subconsciously raised his coffee cup towards the speaker and said with a smile, "Are the onion pancakes good? I saw that you didn't leave any for me yesterday." The voice on the other side paused for a moment, as if not used to this kind of conversation. After a while, the voice said softly, "Is it too boring to practice alone? Do you want to try it online?" Sulu was stunned and scratched his wet hair. He had never seen the person in the other room before, so he was naturally curious. Although he didn't take the initiative to try to open the door in order to keep his secret, after several days of coffee and supper, he felt that he wasn't unfamiliar with the other party. More importantly, these days of practice made him realize that he seemed to be getting more and more interested in piloting mecha. He also felt that his level was improving a little too quickly. It was just that he lacked a real comparison, so he was not sure how good he was. Looking for a beating? Come on then. Sulu put the coffee cup beside him and clenched his fist. The voice on the other side paused for a moment, as if it did not expect Sulu to say such ridiculous words. There was a hint of seriousness in the voice. There are not many people who dare to speak to me like this. Chapter 72. Reality proved that the one who was looking for trouble was Sulu, and he was being tortured very badly. In the virtual scenario that took 4 minutes to construct, he only lasted 1 minute before being judged as the loser. A complete failure, and both the human and the machine were destroyed. Looking at the fireworks that represented victory and the small white flags that represented the losers on the screen in front of him, Sulu couldn't help but feel a little disheartened. He was also angry at the designer of this virtual system. He didn't notice that although the designer of H1's virtual combat system was very rough, it used the three-dimensional combat simulation that the federal military had not yet successfully experimented with. Taking the towel beside him and wiping the sweat off his face, Sulu calmed himself down. He broke away from the joy of discovering a treasure trove a few nights ago and repositioned himself as a beginner and a country bumpkin. Smiling, he said to his familiar yet unfamiliar companion on the other side of the communicator, again. The outcome did not change much. In the next few practice matches, no matter what kind of terrain was chosen, Sulu was still beaten to a pulp by the mecha on the other side of the screen. Although he had stronger nerves than anyone else, his mecha combat experience was close to zero. Of course, he was no match for the person on the other side of the screen. Tai Ziyuan did not want to get to know that young student doorman. His identity and position were too sensitive. He should not have had any relationship with someone of Su Li's level. If it were not for some vague reason, Tai Ziyuan would not have even allowed Su Lu to enter H1, even if he was a student recommended by Professor Jean, even if Professor Jean was the designer of H1. He did not know if it was because the sleepless nights were too boring, or because of the steaming hot soy milk, or the oily supper that he could not name, but which had an indescribably delicious taste, or because the young master of the Tai family had not seen anyone close to his age by his side for a long time. He allowed Su Lu to enter District H1 every night, but even so, he was not prepared to meet Su Lu. On this point, he somewhat admired this young man for his understanding of the situation. He had never tried to knock on his door. Just because we don't see each other doesn't mean we can't talk, Tai Ziyuan told himself in his heart. He was a little curious as to why this seemingly ordinary student would suffer from insomnia every night. Could it be that the other party was also bearing the same kind of pressure as him? Thinking of this, Tai Ziyuan couldn't help but smile bitterly. In this world, there was no one else of the same age who could have the same pressure as him. Bored to death, he casually started a sentence and couldn't stop himself. Since he had already spoken, could he fight with the other party in the virtual environment event? Tai Ziyuan said to himself in his heart. Coincidentally, he was also a little curious about the other party's training progress. Because he had tried level 6 before, he knew how difficult it was. The other party had been able to go from being completely clueless at the beginning to being able to persist for 17 seconds in just 10 short days. This was really an impressive result. Tai Ziyuan himself had only lasted 30 seconds when he had tried level 6. Even if he had improved now, the improvement would not be too big. The successor of the Tai family, a long time ago, should be the identity of the crown prince. Even in today's federation, the head of the 7 great families, the Tai family, still hid its enormous body in the shadows, like a mythical creature whose head and tail would never appear in the clouds at the same time. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call this family the emperor of another level of the federation. With this kind of identity, Tai Ziyuan didn't have any real friends since he was young. When he hid his identity and studied in a primary school directly affiliated to the Federation in the capital, he got to know the Zhou family siblings. However, when the Zhou family guessed his identity, everything changed. No matter how noble Tai Ziyuan's identity was, no matter how prominent his family background was, he was still a 17-year-old youth. He was currently suffering through the torment of adolescence, suppressing his rebellious impulses under pressure, using impeccable appearance and dignity to bury his hot-blooded impulses. Everyone who had experienced youth knew that hot-bloodedness was the hardest to suppress. That was why Tai Ziyuan had chosen to roar to the heavens in the empty H1 district, even though his roar was a little choppy and unaccustomed to it. He had never fought before, and no one had dared to hit him. He wanted to find the feeling of a real, human, and today, he seemed to have found a little bit of it, because that fallen mecha always stood up once again. That stubborn, but also that smiling face, like a roly-poly toy that always had its lips curled up. It was very interesting to hit it. Picking up the packed lamb chop in the resting room, Tai Ziyuan smiled as he drank a cup of coffee, stuffed a caviar into his mouth, and added a new line on the piece of white paper that was already filled with many lines. He walked back to his villa from H1 district. He didn't know if it was because he had used up too much energy, but he slept exceptionally well that night. When Sulu walked out of the room, he noticed that more than half of the supper on the table was gone. He raised his knife-like eyebrows. After so many days, this was the first time that person left before him. He walked to the table and picked up the piece of white paper, only to see a line written on it, "The lamb chop tastes good. This is the first time that kid praised me for the supper I worked so hard to get, right?" Sulu rubbed his head a little angrily, thinking that even if he beat me, he doesn't have to be so smug. But for some reason, looking at the line of "tastes good," Sulu felt a little happy. He picked up the pen and wrote his reply on the piece of paper. "What's so good about synthetic lamb chop? I'll find a chance to get you some wild lamb." When Sulu wrote this sentence, he suddenly remembered that a year ago on the spaceship, he had made a similar promise to that little girl. He couldn't help but feel a little emotional. A year had passed. How much did that smart and cute little girl grow up? Would she still hate eating like before? The next day, when Tai Ziyuan saw the words on the piece of paper, he couldn't help but slightly curl his lips into a smile. The wildlife protection law was indeed very strict, and it wasn't that easy to eat it. But for him, it was nothing. However, Tai Ziyuan was very self-disciplined in life, and never touched it. He replied on the piece of paper, "I don't like it, get me 2 of those pancakes on the night of the 17th, it's deep-fried pancakes." Sulu looked at the piece of paper and shook his head, replying, "No problem. Since you are a tasteless person who doesn't know how to eat caviar pancakes, why did you eat all of them?" Tai Ziyuan angrily left a message. "I just found out that it's such an expensive thing, of course I have to eat more. I brought you so many days of food, I can't lose out, right? Besides, this kind of thing always needs to be cultivated. If I eat a few more, maybe I won't think that it's bad food. A man shouldn't be so stingy. I'll bring you some roasted red potatoes tomorrow. I want 3. I originally wanted to wait for you to come out today, but I didn't expect you to leave so early. I'm not interested in meeting you." Time passed as the lines of words on the piece of white paper extended downwards. Occasionally, at night, these 2 young men would speak a few words through the communication device and arrange for the mock battle. As for the type and quantity of supper, as well as the childish behavior of haggling over every ounce, it was still recorded on the piece of white paper. They probably both thought that it was very interesting. They still hadn't met. Sulu had once made this request, but since the other party wasn't willing, he let it go. "That piece of paper is almost full now. I'm really curious, why is that kid's insomnia so bad?" In the cafeteria at noon, Sulu ate with a spoon while talking to the girl opposite him. Recently, he had gotten used to this kind of work and rest schedule, and he rarely went to H area during the day, so the time to eat and talk with Zhang Xiaomeng had returned to the beginning. There were fewer strange looks coming from all around, because the separation of young men and women was a common occurrence in this school. Sulu, a poor student, had a miraculous performance in Professor Zhou's class, which gave him a lot of points, so there were fewer people who felt indignant for Zhang Xiaomeng. Sulu knew what kind of relationship he had with Zhang Xiaomeng. He just subconsciously liked sitting across from this girl who was as pure as water. It felt like clear spring water that refreshed his heart. But when he was facing Zhang Xiaomeng, he felt very nervous, and this kind of nervousness made him feel very uneasy. Could it be the legendary thing? However, at this time, Zhang Xiaomeng was in a daze. Her clear eyes had a touch of melancholy, and she looked at the autumn scene outside the cafeteria through the lens of her black-rimmed glasses. She didn't pay attention to what Sulu said, and it was the information she missed that she would regret very much in the near future. The tips of the trees on campus were slightly yellow, and the autumn wind kept swaying them. The sky through the black-rimmed glasses on Zhang Xiaomeng's nose swayed gently, and the people who looked at her couldn't help but want to fall into the sky. Sulu stared at her in a daze, feeling empty in his heart, but also full, sour, and sweet. He didn't understand why there was an indescribable feeling under Xiaomeng's calm appearance, as if she could disappear at any time. Sulu liked the idea that the opposite side of the cafeteria table could become empty at any time. The dance is starting next week. Zhang Xiaomeng suddenly turned her head, smiled, and said to him, "You've been busy recently, and I don't know what you've been busy with. There's no class tomorrow, so let's go out and buy clothes. Sulu nodded and was about to say something when Zhang Xiaoming lowered her head and said softly, "Of course we'll use your money, don't worry about anything." Chapter 73. The university town was located in the north of the capital planet. Other than the harsh winter weather, most of the time, the sun would rise too early, making it difficult for people to adapt. At 6 in the morning, Zhang Xiaoming woke up from her sleep. She fumbled around to put on the black-framed glasses that never left her side. She stretched her body and looked at the beautiful Rose River outside the window. The clear river water and the slightly yellow trees in the autumn made her fall into deep thought. Although she had returned to S1, her heart was still in S2. She served Senator Macklin and had her own missions and responsibilities. When she returned to Yue University last year, her most important mission was to get close to the mysterious young man with the codename Prince. She also wanted to try to establish a good relationship between Senator Macklin and the head of the 7 families, the Tai family. The wireless network that was spread throughout the Federation allowed her to receive the senator's orders at any time. However, she had been back at Yue University for more than half a year, and the black-framed glasses had never been activated. Her life was so peaceful that she almost forgot her true identity. Until the day before yesterday, a message appeared on the black-framed glasses. The senator informed her that they had confirmed that the target was indeed studying at Yue University, but they were unable to find out where he lived. However, according to the intelligence, the target would definitely attend the Double Moon Festival Ball next week. Senator Macklin directly gave her a sincere order through his subordinates. She had to find a way to get close to the prince at the ball and create a positive atmosphere before the other forces. The autumn scenery outside the window was so beautiful, and Zhang Xiaoming's mood was so cold. The information about the prince was not detailed, but the most important point had already pointed her in the right direction. A young man who could tolerate the temper of the eldest daughter of the Zhou family, a young man who had been disciplined since young, would definitely have a rebellious impulse. He was especially curious about love. Love? Then what about my love? Zhang Xiaoming was just a young girl under the age of 20. She had also fantasized about her future countless times, about her own love. However, the autumn scenery outside the window gradually turned into a face that was always squinting, filled with sincerity, kindness, and tolerance. Zhang Xiaoming laughed self-deprecatingly. Sulu was too honest. Bruce Scholar, a staunch supporter of George Carlin's theories and the best interpreters in society, believed that love in this world was just like a fist. It was also divided into sizes. The love between a man and a woman, as well as the love of family, was very beautiful, but none of these could compare to the deepest and most lasting love for the entire human race, for the Federation. For the great love of the world, he had to sacrifice his little love. Zhang Xiaoming stood in front of the window and gradually clenched her fists. The world she saw through the glass was always different. Perhaps it was more realistic, or perhaps it was more fake. Zhang Xiaoming seemed to see those comrades who persisted in resisting the Federation in Mountain S2 in order to seek a fairer future. She seemed to see those citizens who constantly struggled at the bottom of society and wasted their lives. She also saw those politicians who held most of the power and shamelessly manipulated elections, as well as the tycoons and families behind those politicians. There were too many injustices in the world. Getting in touch with the Tai family that imposed the injustices on the world was just a means. Zhang Xiaoming's pure heart floated in the pure sky. She was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of eradicating the unfairness of this world under the leadership of Senator Macklin, including the love that hadn't even had the chance to sprout. However, before the love that hadn't had time to start turned into ashes, she should still have time to enjoy it to her heart's content one last time. She should give a warm response to the young man and leave behind a memory, although the ending of this memory would definitely be sad. Zhang Xiaoming's fists gradually loosened. She resolutely took off the black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose and put them into a password-locked metal drawer. Then, she spread her black hair and carefully began to dress herself up. In the early morning at the back entrance of Yue University, in the cold autumn wind, Sulu looked at the girl in front of him wearing a sky-blue spaghetti strap dress. He couldn't believe his eyes. He wasn't surprised that Zhang Xiaomeng would wear so little in such cold weather. Instead, it was the first time he realized that Zhang Xiaomeng could actually be so beautiful. Whether it was on the bus at the airport, at the dining table in the cafeteria, or on the track in the sports field, Sulu saw that Zhang Xiaomeng always wore a pair of black-rimmed glasses on her nose. The other students were probably the same. It seemed that no one knew what Zhang Xiaomeng looked like without her glasses. Zhang Xiaomeng, who wore glasses, was quiet and innocent. But at this moment, Zhang Xiaomeng, who took off her glasses, was like a different person. Her bright eyes had a charming smile. Her eyes, which were not filtered by the glasses, were very moving, as if they could speak. She had no makeup on her face, picturesque eyebrows, cute lips, and a sky-blue spaghetti strap dress that exposed her slender white neck and a small piece of skin in front of her chest, exuding a youthful aura. It was very attractive and mesmerizing. "Do I look good?" Zhang Xiaomeng tilted her head slightly and blinked her eyes cutely. She stared at Su Li's slightly embarrassed face and playfully tugged at the hem of her sky-blue dress. It was obvious that she was preparing to give herself one last day of freedom and recklessness. She was preparing to give a relatively beautiful ending to those hidden feelings that had yet to be revealed. Zhang Xiaomeng, who had let go of her feelings, was no longer the same as before. Instead, she looked a lot cuter, a lot more cheerful, and a lot more adorable. She was more like the girl who was resentful and angry because someone stole her puppy biscuit. Sulu also felt that Zhang Xiaomeng's mood today was different from usual, but this difference was what he liked. In order to cover up the awkwardness of his silence, he coughed twice and walked up to her. He said sincerely, "Very beautiful." Although he said it was very beautiful, Su Li's hands acted as if they did not listen to his command. He took the short windbreaker from Zhang Xiaomeng's elbow and mechanically draped it over her body. He said, "It's cold, wear more." This had nothing to do with the cold or heat. It was purely the youth's nature causing trouble. Although Su Lu and Zhang Xiaomeng had not had anything to do with each other until now, that vague feeling had been slowly and sweetly fermenting. Out of instinct, Su Lu did not want other men to see Zhang Xiaomeng's exposed shoulders. Zhang Xiaomeng also sensed something and whispered, "Stingy." After saying this, Zhang Xiaomeng very naturally hooked her arm around Su Li's elbow. Half of Su Li's body suddenly turned to stone. He moved his feet a little uncoordinated. The autumn wind suddenly had a hint of spring charm, making his face feel a little hot. The shopping trip ended quickly. At least Su Lu, who was considered a middle-class person, did not get the supercilious looks of the shop assistants. Although Zhang Xiaomeng also bought a few sets of clothes, she was not as picky as the average girl. She chose to pay for them and packed them up. After doing all this, the young couple began to shop in the busiest area of Linhai. They walked and walked like this, hand in hand, like a couple in love. We didn't hold hands. Sulu accurately judged what he should do now. Could this be a date? Things seemed to be developing a little too quickly. However, the soft body beside him and the light fragrance made his heart a little flustered. After walking for about 7 kilometers on the streets of Linhai, Su Lu and Zhang Xiaomeng's arms dropped by 7 centimeters. The two of them looked straight ahead, pretending not to notice this difficult and long 7-centimeter drop. At this time, Zhang Xiaomeng's hand was already holding Su Li's forearm as if they were not touching. Her eyes flashed with a hint of a smile, thinking that Su Lu was really an honest guy. "I'm hungry. Let's go eat." After walking along the stone path of the Rose River for another half an hour, Su Lu suddenly said something very seriously. Then, his right hand held Zhang Xiaomeng's soft and slightly cold hand as if it was a matter of course, and he pulled her towards a restaurant by the street. His hand was sweaty. "There should be a lot of rumors about me in school. Zhang Xiaomeng sat across from him at the table, carefully cutting the black pepper steak. She lowered her head and asked, "Do you have any thoughts? Are you asking me to praise you and then confess?" At this time, Su Lu also lowered his head, carefully cutting the synthetic beef that was too uniform in terms of meat fiber. He thought to himself, but what he said was another sentence. "I don't think you care much about what other people think." Zhang Xiaomeng raised her head slightly in surprise. A trace of a lonely smile appeared on her face. She said softly, "A lot of people think that I'm a childish, unrealistic, naive, and ridiculous woman. They think that I would actually give up my studies and run to District S2 for my so-called ideals." Su Lu was stunned. He did not expect Zhang Xiaomeng to talk about this matter. He had heard about her past on campus, but from the time they met, Su Lu saw Zhang Xiaomeng as a little girl who was quiet and calm in front of others, but who was a little mischievous in private. He could not associate her with that image at all. He thought about it and said with a smile, "You're back, aren't you? Besides, as long as it's an ideal, it should always be respected." Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him and was silent for a moment. She asked seriously, "What do you think of George Carlin?" Su Lu did not have any opinions about politics or George Carlin. He thought that Zhang Xiaomeng had returned to District S1 to seek some kind of spiritual support. He said hesitantly, "Theory may be good, but to use it to guide behavior, maybe." "Well, to be honest, I think what he said makes sense." Zhang Xiaomeng smiled with relief. She looked at him and said, "Although I've returned to university, actually, I've always missed the time in District S2. Actually, I've always been a believer of George Carlin." Su Lu was slightly surprised. He thought to himself, "Then why did you come back?" Zhang Xiaomeng did not continue the question. She looked at Su Lu and thought with some jealousy in her heart. If it were not for those things, and she had a natural development with this honest and cute boy in front of her, perhaps it would have been a wonderful thing. Zhang Xiaomeng habitually looked out the window and said quietly, "Do you believe in love?" "Yes. I don't know what love is." Zhang Xiaomeng looked at the pedestrians outside the window. "Even if I understand what love is in the future, what is forever?" Su Lu looked at her face as she looked out the window at the pedestrians. He smiled and thought to himself, Zhang Xiaomeng is really a neurotic girl. In his heart, love was something that only needed to be believed. It did not need to be understood. But today, such a beautiful girl was about to make him believe. Chapter 74. This was Su Li's first time treating someone of the opposite sex to a meal in a formal restaurant, so he was a little nervous. Once he was nervous, his eyes would subconsciously not look anywhere else but at the only girl he was familiar with. However, when he glanced over, he saw her chest that was not covered by the sky-blue spaghetti-strap dress. His heart fluttered when he saw her fair breasts that were half covered by the dress. He quickly shifted his gaze up, only to see Zhang Xiaomeng's lowered face. Her slightly curled eyelashes, and her red lips and white teeth were gently biting on the fork. His heart was even more flustered. The temperature in the restaurant was maintained at 26 degrees, and the black pepper steak was slightly spicy. A cute bead of sweat seeped out of the tip of Zhang Xiaomeng's nose. She had already taken off the short windbreaker that she was wearing, and her entire person was unintentionally releasing a pure charm. Perhaps it was because of the food, or because she had noticed Su Li's glance just now, Zhang Xiaomeng's sideburns had turned slightly red. However, she did not deliberately hide the view in front of her chest. She maintained this seductive posture, awkwardly displaying her charm. Su Lu knew where his eyes should be looking, but Zhang Xiaomeng did not know where he was looking. Both of them had different thoughts in their minds, and they fell into an awkward silence. "I like you." Su Li's extremely serious and firm words broke the silence. Zhang Xiaomeng raised her head in surprise and looked at the honest boy in front of her. She never would have thought that he would confess to her so directly. For a moment, her language skills were a little lacking. She stammered, What did you say? I said, I like you very much. Sulu repeated that sentence again. Because it was the second time, he said it much more naturally than before. He looked at Zhang Xiaomeng's delicate face and thought to himself, when you look out the window, I always want you to look at me. This should be called like, right? Why? Zhang Xiaomeng lowered her head, a little flustered. Today, she just wanted to have one last faint moment of youth and enjoy it to her heart's content. She did not expect Sulu to suddenly ask her such a question, and this question came so quickly and firmly. You don't need a reason to like someone. Sulu looked at the plate on the table. There was still steak and juice left on the plate. It was as if he was looking at an extremely difficult obstacle to overcome. He held the knife and fork tightly with both hands and said, if we argue from a physiological and psychological point of view, we are releasing some kind of information to each other. We can feel it, so we like each other. Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him blankly. After all, she was just a girl who had never been in a relationship before. No matter how determined she was and how meticulous she would never know that there were many kinds of love, and there were also many kinds of men. Some men were like Sulu, who would only choose the most direct way to attack and would not give her any time to quietly leave. Ha! Zhang Xiaomeng tried to hide her panic. I don't understand. Sulu raised his head and stared into her eyes. After hesitating for a moment, he said seriously, I once had an elder tell me that if you meet a girl when you are young, and you don't want to peek at her body at all, and you don't dare to fantasize about things related to lust in your mind, then it proves that you like her, and it's a real kind of like. Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him blankly and asked, what kind of theory is this? If you are not interested in my body. She wanted to say, if you are not interested in my body, why did you look at it just now, and why do you like me? However, halfway through, she realized that this kind of discussion was a little too naked and explicit. She quickly lowered her head and asked in a soft voice, how many people have you met like this? 2. Sulu answered quickly. This answer had actually been in his mind for a long time. Zhang Xiaomeng raised her head and asked with interest, who else is there besides me? She wanted to pretend to be indifferent and ask a question out of interest between friends, but her flashing eyes revealed that she actually really cared that Sulu had other girls in his heart. Jian Shuier. Sulu smiled in a seemingly simple and honest manner, which made Zhang Xiaomeng roll her eyes. All the men in the Federation, from young to old, liked that little girl with purple hair. Sulu looked at Zhang Xiaomeng's slightly blushing face, and his heart skipped a beat. The theory that he just relayed was actually something that Uncle Boss once said. However, he didn't tell Zhang Xiaomeng everything. Back then, Uncle Feng Yu was sitting in the twilight with a glass of red wine in his left hand and a piece of beef in his right. He said to the young Sulu, but the problem is that this kind of liking is only a little boy's liking after being influenced by too many romance novels. When you have 100 women, you will understand what love is all about. Eye to eye, in fact, is just for the friction between flesh, the exchange of bodily fluids. At that time, Sulu, who was still a virgin, naturally believed in love and selectively forgot the last part of Uncle Feng's words. There was a long silence. The piano in the far corner of the restaurant was flowing with notes. Occasionally, there was the sound of silver knives and forks touching the surface of the porcelain. In this silence, Sulu lowered his head and waited for the other person's answer. He didn't notice that after a long silence, Zhang Xiaomeng was looking at him with a guilty and resentful gaze. She had her own life, Sulu had Su Li's life, and these two lives were destined to never walk the same path. Her heart gave birth to endless pity for this honest boy in front of her, or perhaps this pity was projected onto her own heart. Looking at Su Li's quiet eyebrows, Zhang Xiaomeng's heart trembled slightly. She knew that she shouldn't be greedy for this kind of feeling and let him sink into it. I'm sorry. When Sulu heard these 3 words, he raised his head and looked directly into Zhang Xiaomeng's eyes. Why? I know you like to be with me. He didn't have much experience or wisdom when it came to the human heart, but he was extremely sensitive to other people's thoughts. This was also the insight that Feng Yu admired the most. The sky blue halter top, the accompaniment on the sports field, and the different scenery in the cafeteria for so many days made it clear to him that Xiaomeng was the same as him. They had both been poisoned by some kind of drug that had unknowingly started to take effect. As for when it started, perhaps these two young children didn't know, but at least they knew that it had already started. You said before that you don't need a reason to like me or not. Zhang Xiaomeng lowered her eyes slightly, her eyelashes trembling slightly. And just because I like to be with you doesn't mean that I have to like you. I don't know why you rejected me. Su Lu was silent for a long time, then suddenly said, but I know, you like me. It was such a simple, ordinary, and direct sentence from his heart, a seemingly unreasonable and childish judgment, but it struck Zhang Xiaomeng's heart. She looked at the boy in front of her in shock. Her eyes gradually softened, but then there was a flash of pain. She finally understood that it wasn't because of the arrival of the mission that made her a little greedy for the last of her free youth, nor was it because she liked the feeling when she was with Su Lu. That was why she went on a date with him today. The so-called youth, the so-called feeling, was actually just as he said. Unknowingly, she had fallen in love with this boy. With a bang, Su Lu quietly took out a vacuum-sealed bag and opened it amidst the sound of the piano. He took a piece of dog biscuit from the bag and placed it in Zhang Xiaomeng's red lips, which were still slightly open due to her complicated emotions. Zhang Xiaomeng finished the biscuit without tasting it. She looked at him with a complicated expression and said, I'm a selfish person. I'll hurt you. You know that I was a soldier in Donglin. I'm like a rock in Donglin. I'm not afraid of wind or rain. Is there anyone as glib as you are a rock? Zhang Xiaomeng quietly looked at Su Li's face. Su Li's small eyes seemed to have made some kind of decision. He smiled, and the light blended into the sound of the piano, illuminating the hall. She took out a pair of small red devil horns from the bag beside her and put them on her head. She tilted her head slightly, and like lightning, her lips touched Su Li's lips. After she sat back in her chair, she narrowed her eyes and asked in a charming and sexy manner, do I look good? On a certain night in the autumn of the 66th year of the constitutional era, at the back door of Pear Blossom University's quiet pear garden, there was a girl in thin pajamas. Her feet were bare. She quietly came to the small gatekeeper in the cold and knocked on the door. She wore a pair of small red devil horns on her head. She looked like a demon from the depths of the universe. The gatekeeper in the room was immersed in the emotions of the day. He was thinking about the future sweetly and worriedly. He had forgotten all the things he was supposed to do, and he was unable to sleep. Then he realized that he had a dream. The girl he was gently hugging in his dream had crawled into his bed and hugged him tightly. The girl's body was cold. Her nightgown draped over her thighs, appearing incomparably soft and smooth. His hands, which were usually incomparably steady on the chip set and components, moved up the nightgown and began to tremble. Touching the girl's smooth and slightly shivering skin, the cold of this autumn day had long turned into heat. Isn't this too fast? Sulu only had time to think of this sentence before he was once again immersed in that warm and gentle dreamland. His hands awkwardly pressed on the girl's delicate breasts. He felt that at this moment, he had finally found the true meaning of life. In the darkness, Zhang Xiaomeng, who was lying in Su Li's arms, cried. She cried very sadly. Hearing the crying, Su Li nervously asked, does it hurt? A little. I can still bear it. I can't bear it anymore. I'm sorry, if I hurt you. The girl with her bare feet left with some difficulty. The elf with the red devil horns quietly disappeared in the morning fog, as if she had never appeared. The frustrated Sulu opened his eyes wide, but he did not understand why she had to apologize when he should be the one apologizing. Chapter 75. Although it was already autumn in the university town, it was still early in the morning. It was only 5 in the morning, but the campus was already bright. It was the weekend, so many students from Lin High had gone home. The cold autumn wind made people lose interest in coming out for morning exercises. The female dormitories in the university town were all given elegant names, such as Osmanthus Garden, Plum Garden, Pear Garden. At this time, Plum Garden dormitory was empty. There were no cars, no male students lighting candles to show their love, and no girls going in and out chattering non-stop. There was only a boy holding a bouquet of flowers and a thermos flask. The flowers were wildflowers that had just been picked by the Rose River. There was still dew on them, just like the girl who had bloomed for the first time last night. The freshly cooked porridge in the thermos would not cool down no matter how long it was left in there, just like the boy's burning heart. In the cold wind, Sulu rubbed his hands and looked up at a certain room on the 7th floor of Plum Garden. A happy smile appeared on his face. He didn't sleep the whole night until the sunlight of the university town shone through the window. Only then did he realize that he seemed to have done a lot of wrong things. How could he let Xiaomeng go home alone last night? Until now, he still felt that everything that had happened last night was just a dream. It felt unreal. He also realized that he didn't give Xiaomeng any flowers. This was an unforgivable mistake. If Shi Qinghai knew, he would definitely scold him. In order not to let the girl down, he immediately took remedial measures. He cooked porridge, picked flowers, and even carefully went to the 24-hour pharmacy to buy ointment and emergency contraceptive pills. If Xiaomeng was injured, he could apply the ointment. If Xiaomeng was afraid of accidents, he could take Tingting's emergency contraceptive pills. Of course, if Xiaomeng didn't want to take them and got pregnant in the future, he could get married. With his skills, he could find a good job and work hard to support his family. After Xiaomeng gave birth, he could come back to school, and then, the little boy was immersed in his fantasy of happiness. He didn't know that his smile was very silly, and he didn't know that a fantasy was a fantasy after all. Sulu had already made up his mind. He would no longer run away because of his identity as a fugitive from the Federation. He wanted to take responsibility for this relationship and that girl. This kind of heavy feeling of growing up overnight did not make him feel strained. Instead, it gave him a sense of accomplishment that came from his bones. As time passed, more and more girls came out of the Plum Garden apartment. They looked at Sulu as if they were looking at a fool. However, Sulu did not care about the gazes of the crowd at all. He only felt slightly happy and slightly anxious as he waited for Zhang Xiaomeng to appear. He began to feel nervous because he suddenly realized that if he saw Xiaomeng later, he did not know what to say first. Could he ask her if she had eaten? Sulu. A slightly plump girl with a ponytail was yawning at the entrance of the apartment. When she suddenly saw him, she couldn't help but laugh. She was Zhang Xiaomeng's classmate, and their single dormitory was near each other. She didn't know how many times she had seen the scene of Zhang Xiaomeng and the little concierge in the cafeteria, but this was the first time she saw Su Lu come to the entrance of the Plum Garden apartment. You finally gave up that unrealistic sense of inferiority and came to chase after my Xiaomeng? The slightly plump girl looked at Su Lu and laughed, but she was a little surprised. Because he had always appeared so indifferently, not many people really thought that Zhang Xiaomeng would be with this concierge. Su Lu smiled awkwardly and said, yes. Yes, he and Zhang Xiaomeng had developed too quickly. It seemed that he had skipped a lot of necessary steps in between. Even if he followed those movies and chased after her again, what was there to be afraid of? Wouldn't that be a very happy feeling? Besides, he had already chased after her yesterday, he thought to himself. Don't wait, Xiaomeng isn't in the room. I was just about to call her down to eat. The plump girl's words mercilessly shattered Su Li's entire morning's preparations. Xiaomeng isn't here? Su Lu asked in surprise. Yes. I heard that her family had some kind of gathering today. Maybe she went back yesterday. Su Lu stood outside Plum Garden Apartments with flowers and a thermos flask in his hand. He couldn't help but shake his head in disappointment. Only then did he realize that he didn't even have Zhang Xiaomeng's phone number. Only then did he realize that he was really bad at these things. As for Zhang Xiaomeng's family, he had heard her mention them briefly. They seemed to be the upper class of the university town. As for the specific address, he didn't know, because it was obvious that Zhang Xiaomeng didn't have a good impression of her family. Zhang Xiaomeng was wearing a simple but elegant dress, and the black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose were back on. She sat on the sofa in the living room and looked at the boy opposite her with a smile. She listened as he kept apologizing to her, saying that he was really rude at the school gate that day and asking for her forgiveness. Today, the Zhang family had a small gathering, and the young student that was picked by the elders to meet her was also her classmate at Yue University. He was the son of the state senator who was angry on the first day of school. "I'm really sorry." The son of the state senator said very sincerely, "I thought about it later. As a follower of George Carlin, even if I work in the Federation, I can actually help the Federation improve the current situation of information imbalance and reduce the unfairness of society." Zhang Xiaomeng pushed up her black-rimmed glasses and listened carefully. On the one hand, she really couldn't bear too much malice toward a follower of George Carlin. More importantly, the information clearly stated that the son of the state senator was related to the daughter of the Zhou family, and the daughter of the Zhou family was probably the only woman who could get close to the prince at the Double Moon Festival ball. If she wanted to get close to the prince at the ball, she needed a bridge. The sincere son of the state senator in front of her was undoubtedly the only bridge she could find. "Xiaomeng, are you willing to be my dance partner at the Double Moon Festival ball?" The son of the state senator was named Hai Qingzhou. It was a very handsome name, and he had a face that wasn't annoying. He sincerely apologized to Zhang Xiaomeng, and then even more sincerely extended an invitation. "I'm willing, but you have to be clear that this doesn't mean that I'll submit to my parents' arrangements." When she said this, Zhang Xiaomeng felt that she had played the role of a rebellious girl perfectly. She still hadn't been completely swallowed by the rules of the Federation's upper management, so she was somewhat satisfied. However, she didn't understand that she was a rebellious girl to begin with. She didn't need to perform at all. Perhaps the far-sighted Senator Macklin from S2 saw this trait of hers. Hai Qingzhou smiled and said, "Maybe you'll change your mind in the future." Thinking about her mission at the Double Moon Festival ball, thinking about how she had personally invited Su Lu to be her dance partner, thinking about how they looked at each other in the restaurant yesterday, and the sweetness of that night, Zhang Xiaomeng lowered her head, and her face was slightly pale. Hai Qingzhou asked with concern, "Are you feeling unwell?" Zhang Xiaomeng forced a smile and shook her head to show that she was fine. However, the next moment, in the bathroom of the bedroom on the second floor, she began to cover her lower abdomen. Cold sweat dripped down her pale face. She gritted her teeth and looked at herself in the mirror and said hatefully, "Su Lu, you damn bastard." Su Lu was indeed a bastard in this matter, Zhang Xiaomeng thought hatefully. "Although I was about to dump you, how could you not call me and come to see me?" The more she thought about it, the more she felt wronged. She felt that she had been too impulsive last night. She actually cried in the bathroom. "I have to forget him, I have to forget him. The Double Moon Festival ball is about to begin. He was in my life, so I'll forget him and never think about him again." Zhang Xiaomeng wiped her tears, tidied up her appearance, put on her black-rimmed glasses, and returned to being a quiet schoolgirl. She walked out. "I just want you to help me check a phone number." "Is it that difficult?" Su Lu, who hadn't seen Zhang Xiaomeng all day, began to feel uneasy. He was like an ant on a hot pan. At this time, he remembered that he was obsessed with District H1 and rarely saw Zhang Xiaomeng. He felt that he was extremely stupid at that time. He had a faint ominous feeling, which made his expression become even more serious and agitated. He stared at the rogue official opposite him and said in a low voice, "You're the section chief of the Federation's Investigation Bureau. Checking a phone number is just a matter of a sentence." Shi Qinghai didn't pay attention to his anger and just looked at him quietly. At this time, the two of them were in a deserted bar outside the back door of Pear Garden. There were no customers around. Shi Qinghai frowned and asked, I don't need to tell you how strict the First Charter's protection of a citizen's privacy is. As a government official, of course I can't knowingly break the law. But what I'm most concerned about right now is, why do you want to check the phone number of that girl named Zhang Xiaomeng? Su Lu was silent for a moment. He raised his head and said somewhat shyly, she's my girlfriend. I haven't seen her for a day, so I'm a little worried. The cigarette in Shi Qinghai's hand trembled. He looked seriously at Su Lu and said word by word, repeat that. I know this matter is a little strange. I still don't understand it. I also know that I'm a jerk. I don't even have my girlfriend's phone number. I'm too embarrassed to ask her classmate. This matter is too embarrassing. Su Lu laughed foolishly as he talked non-stop. On the capital planet of the Federation, he had too few friends. The rogue official in front of him happened to be the closest person to him. He had fallen into happiness, so of course he was willing to share his happiness with the other party. Shi Qinghai took a puff of his cigarette and waved his hand to stop him from asking any more questions. He leaned back in his chair and sighed with a frown. It's over. It's really over. What's wrong? Looking at your idiotic smile and the way you talk, I'm sure you're really in a relationship with that Zhang Xiaomeng. Shi Qinghai said with a gloomy face, but the question is, don't you think this matter is a little strange? Chapter 76. What's so strange about it? There's a song called, Bad People Love You, and you're the most honest person I've ever met in my life. I don't understand why Zhang Xiaomeng would fall for you. Shi Qinghai's expression was calm, but his heart was worried. Because of his dual identities, he knew better than anyone what Zhang Xiaomeng did, and Su Lu was his brother. He couldn't just watch as Su Lu was dragged into a net of unknown colors. Su Lu said, not all girls like a hooligan like you. Zhang Xiaomeng, there's something wrong with this person. After a moment of silence, Shi Qinghai violated the rules of the organization and said to Su Lu, she went to S2, and the timing of her return to Yue University is too strange. I don't really care about politics, and I know she's a follower of George Carlin. But don't forget, the most fanatical follower of George Carlin in Yue University is the son of that state senator. Why haven't I seen the Bureau of Investigation investigate him? Shi Qinghai wiped his wine-stained palm on his wrinkled suit and said, trust me, I know more than you. Even if she's still working for the people in S2, what does that have to do with me? Su Lu said with a smile, Senator Macklin has already come to the Federation to run for office. The Federation can't possibly start a civil war, right? He himself was a fugitive, so he didn't care about politics. And from an emotional point of view, he had a better impression of the opposition. After all, it was the Federation that killed the uncle and destroyed his original path of life. But he still didn't believe that a naive girl like Zhang Xiaomeng would be a spy sent to the university by the opposition. Because after last night, he was sure that no one knew the girl better than he did. At least she won't have any intention of using me, right? Looking at Shi Qinghai's gloomy face, Su Lu knew that he was worried about him, so he comforted him, I'm just an ordinary student with a bank card. That's true. But I still don't understand why she would have the leisure to date you at this time, Shi Qinghai said sarcastically. Su Lu did not understand this sentence. He stood up with a cigarette in his mouth and warned, try not to leave school in the future. Zhou Yu has already returned to the 3rd military region, but the daughter of the Zhou family has entered your school. Something might happen. This was the first time Su Lu had heard this news, but he didn't care much. After all, too much time had passed, and he still missed Zhang Xiaomeng. Shi Qinghai glanced at the restless teenager, sighed, and walked out of the bar. I will be with her during the Double Moon Festival dance, Su Lu said to his back. I wish she would kick you away. Also, I've gotten an invitation for the Double Moon Festival ball. See you then. Shi Qinghai waved his hand behind his head and walked out of the bar. Shi Qinghai, the head of Section 4 of the Federation Investigation Bureau's Linhai Field Office. Section 4 of the office was responsible for preventing anti-government infiltration and espionage activities within the Federation. However, other than his direct superiors, no one knew that his real identity was an intelligence agent sent by the anti-government army to Area S1 of the Federation. Or rather, a spy. Many years ago, Shi Qinghai's father, who was doing a rare job in the Federation, mysteriously died in an accident. The Shi family's small farm was assigned to a large company in the Federation. From that day on, Shi Qinghai, who was still a child, lost all respect and trust for the Federation. When he was studying at the first military academy, his psychology professor discovered him, recruited him, and educated him. He learned that there were people in the Federation who were working hard to eliminate the unfairness covered by the law. This psychology professor later became the director of the HTD Bureau in Linhai Field Office. Shi Qinghai, who joined the Federation Investigation Bureau, also became a spy. The head of Section 4 of the office, who was responsible for preventing anti-government infiltration, was actually a member of the anti-government army. This fact was ridiculous, but it also showed that the anti-government forces spared no effort in infiltrating the Federation. It was extremely rare for a spy to be able to sit in such a key position as Shi Qinghai, which also showed his cautiousness. It was precisely because of his dual identity and keen sense of smell that even though the FBI had already stopped monitoring Zhang Xiaomeng, he was still sensitive enough to notice that the girl was different. It was a kind of temperament. Back when he secretly went to S2 for short-term training, Shi Qinghai didn't know how many young people like Zhang Xiaomeng were willing to burn for their ideals. That kind of temperament couldn't be hidden no matter how hard he tried. Shi Qinghai didn't like these young people. He often thought that compared to him, these people were too unprofessional. The anti-government forces were now divided into two major factions. One was the moderate faction led by Senator Medellin, and the other was the radical faction based on the anti-government forces. Shi Qinghai belonged to the anti-government forces. In his opinion, the sanctimonious old man Senator Medellin was just a shameless politician who only knew how to use political resources to achieve his own goals. Of course, after all, everyone could be working for the anti-government forces. Shi Qinghai didn't try to find out Zhang Xiaomeng's true identity, but tonight, he heard Su Lu say that his girlfriend was Zhang Xiaomeng. This news immediately alerted Shi Qinghai, because it was related to his friend. Su Li's words almost convinced him, but he still felt that something was wrong. How could Zhang Xiaomeng have a reason to be in a romantic relationship when the Double Moon Festival ball was just around the corner? Zhou Yu had entered Yue University. In the eyes of people like Shi Qinghai, it was only natural that he had confirmed the position of Crown Prince. He judged that Senator Macklin would definitely not give up on this opportunity. Zhang Xiaomeng was most likely here because of this matter, so he could not understand why Zhang Xiaomeng would do such a thing at this time. In fact, this was because Mr. Shi had forgotten what he had always believed: these people were too unprofessional, and Zhang Xiaomeng was obviously the most unprofessional and naive girl among them. Before getting into the car, Shi Qinghai subconsciously pressed his left breast pocket with his finger. Inside was the invitation card for the Double Moon Festival ball he had asked someone to get for Yue University. Of course, he had used the excuse that he was famous for loving young female students. He had already sent back the information that the target, Crown Prince, was in Yue University. However, there were too few people in the Federation, so it was impossible to continue investigating. He had to personally go to the ball to see what was going on. However, there was always a dark cloud floating in his heart. What were the people in the Federation going to do after receiving the information? Did they really just want to stop the influence of the Hawk faction in the Department of National Defense on the Crown Prince? Who was the Crown Prince? Why did other than the Zhou family siblings, Senator Medellin's people and the anti-government army have to curry favor with him? If he was a decisive figure in a big family, why would the anti-government army, whose ultimate goal was to overthrow the 7 big families, want to establish a relationship with him? They should be assassinating him by hook or by crook. Shi Qinghai frowned beautifully. He felt that things were a little out of his expectations. He wasn't familiar with the leaders of the anti-government army, nor did he feel close to them. He was only willing to do something for the people who were against the Federation. However, if this matter involved him, he had to reconsider. Through the car window, Shi Qinghai glanced at Su Lu, who was still in a daze in the bar. He shook his head. As long as he didn't drag this guy into the mess, it was fine. Fortunately, he had nothing to do with this matter. It was already late at night, but the room on the 7th floor of the Plum Garden Apartments was still dark. It seemed that Zhang Xiaomeng would be sleeping at home tonight. He didn't know if she was still in pain, or if she had caught a cold from wearing so little last night. Su Lu stood on the sports field and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the dark room through the autumn trees. He remembered that they were in the same place in the past. Zhang Xiaomeng used her slender finger to point in the direction of the 7th floor, telling him that she stayed there every night. At that time, Su Lu and Zhang Xiaomeng were just friends who could talk to each other. Now that he thought about those scenes, Su Lu felt that everything was already predestined. Immersed in his happy mood, he was thinking about which restaurant he should take Xiaomeng to for a meal when she came back to school. There was still a lot of money in the Sanlin Joint Bank card. It was enough to buy a mid-sized house in Linhai, let alone a meal. Thinking of the meal, Su Lu suddenly thought of something and shouted, "Oh no!" Last night, he promised to bring that guy some deep-fried dough cakes, but he didn't go the whole night. He didn't know if the guy would wait the whole night. Carrying a bag of deep-fried dough cakes into the quiet H1 area, Su Lu saw a large pot of coffee and a few small pieces of caviar in the lounge. He shrugged and put the deep-fried dough cake to the side. He noticed that there was no new content on the piece of paper that was already full of words. He glanced at the closed door and knew that the guy who was also suffering from insomnia like him hadn't arrived yet. He entered the room himself and began practicing the level 6 20-second skill. After some time, the familiar but still cold voice came from the intercom, "Why didn't the deep-fried dough cake come with plain porridge today? It doesn't taste good." Su Lu took off his light filtering goggles and replied with a smile, "I didn't come last night and forgot to tell you. I'm sorry. Plain porridge. I'm saving it for my girlfriend tomorrow." In the other room, Tai Ziyuan was slightly startled. From last night until now, he had been thinking about why Su Lu suddenly disappeared for an entire night. He was even a little angry, but his status and pride didn't allow him to open his mouth and express his dissatisfaction. At this time, when he heard Su Li's explanation, he finally understood what had happened. A trace of ridicule appeared on the corner of his mouth. He thought that university life was really boring, and this interesting guy couldn't help but fall in love. "Let's start." Tai Ziyuan sent out a battle invitation, his calm voice revealing his confidence. However, after just 5 minutes, he moved his hand away from the touch screen, forcibly suppressing his anger and shock, and said into the intercom, "Did you take an aphrodisiac today?" Chapter 77. The young master of the Tai family had lost his composure and said something unbefitting of his status because of Su Li's sudden burst of lascivious mecha operation tonight. The first time Su Lu had defeated a classmate he had never seen before was on his first day as a man. If he had known the true identity of the person he had defeated, perhaps he would have been even more excited. However, in the short span of a day, he had fallen from the peak of happiness to the bottom of the valley. His face was bruised and swollen, his eyes dazed, and he was completely at a loss. Because Zhang Xiaomeng had suddenly disappeared. This did not mean that Zhang Xiaomeng had run away from home and gone to S2 like she had when she had just entered university, playing the faraway farce of disappearing. Rather, it meant that this girl who was used to having sex had suddenly disappeared from Su Li's life. Or rather, in her eyes, Su Lu did not even exist. That morning, Su Lu had nervously and excitedly carried the wildflowers and thermos flask to the outside of Plum Garden Apartments. Then, he saw Zhang Xiaomeng and a few other girls coming out of the apartment together. However, when he walked up to her with a face full of smiles, Zhang Xiaomeng acted as if she did not see him. She brushed past him like a gust of wind, leaving him with a trail of yellow leaves and infinite shock. During the weekend, he had already come here once. Basically, most of the students in Yue University knew that the little gatekeeper had finally courageously launched an attack on Zhang Xiaomeng. However, the scene today seemed to prove that this attack was a complete failure. The girls all cast scornful or sympathetic gazes at him. Unlike the people around him, Su Lu knew what had happened between him and Zhang Xiaomeng that night, so he felt that it was particularly inconceivable. He stared blankly at Zhang Xiaomeng's departing figure, baffled, and feeling that something bad was about to happen. Just as he had been worried, from that moment onwards, Zhang Xiaomeng acted as if she could not see him at all. Whether it was in class, in the laboratory, or in the corridor, wherever the two of them might meet, Zhang Xiaomeng would always walk away with a stubborn look on her face. Su Lu was vexed and puzzled, but he couldn't help but feel that the girl's appearance was really funny and cute. Finally, on the afternoon of the next day, Su Lu could no longer hold back his questions. He stopped Zhang Xiaomeng, who was holding a book, under the big pagoda tree outside the teaching building. He said nervously, "I know I performed badly that night. Ignoring me for 2 days is a very serious punishment." No matter how he thought about it, he could only come to this conclusion. The girl who had just blossomed was exceptionally sensitive psychologically. She was resentful that he was not gentle enough that night, especially when he did not send her back to the apartment. That was why she had ignored him for the past 2 days. Su Lu didn't want to fall into a cold war right from the start of his first love, so he sincerely apologized. Zhang Xiaomeng was inexplicably nervous. She pushed the glasses on the bridge of her nose, cleared her throat, and said seriously, "You've misunderstood. I also want to find time to make it clear to you that the two of us are not suitable for each other. I don't want you to continue to misunderstand. Don't make this kind of joke." Su Lu said with a smile, but his smile was a bit forced. Why did this sound so much like those romantic dramas that were shown on the Federation's Arts channel? At the same time, he also heard the imperceptible tremor in Zhang Xiaomeng's seemingly cold voice. He asked seriously, "What happened?" "Nothing. I'm just calmly thinking about our relationship and future possibilities. I feel that there is no possibility of continuing to develop." Zhang Xiaomeng forcibly suppressed the nervousness and loneliness in her heart and said lightly, "Please forget everything that happened that day." Su Lu felt like a hammer had fallen from the sky and hit his heart. He was stunned, but he still maintained the style of Dong Lin Shi. He stared at Zhang Xiaomeng and said, "Is there something wrong with your brain? Or did you wear too little that night and have a cold or fever?" Zhang Xiaomeng sighed in her heart, but her indifference were obvious in her words. "It's already the 37th constitutional calendar. Do you think it's still the era of the Tai dynasty? It's normal for you to be willing to spend a warm night with each other. You're just a poor student. Even if you can work in nutshell in the future, can you satisfy my material and spiritual needs and spend the rest of my life with me? Wake up. If I said that I was greedy and caused you to misunderstand, I apologize to you, but please keep a distance from me in the future." Hearing the word, sorry, Su Lu suddenly remembered that night in the restaurant. Zhang Xiaomeng seemed to have said it more than once. He stood there a bit numbly, looking at the girl in front of him whose charm was mostly covered by the black-rimmed glasses. He lowered his voice and said with extra force, "Sorry. Do you want me to pretend that nothing happened, and then we'll be strangers forever? Is this very difficult for you?" Zhang Xiaomeng said as indifferently as possible, but she held the book in her arms tighter. Su Lu felt a bit angry, but he didn't show it on his face. He stared into Zhang Xiaomeng's eyes and said, "Of course it's difficult. I'm a virgin. I was cheated by you for the first time, and you don't want to take responsibility?" Zhang Xiaomeng's pretense of arrogance suddenly turned into a collapsed mountain rock. She opened her eyes wide and looked at Su Lu in disbelief. She couldn't imagine that the honest and simple man would say such a strange thing. Su Li's voice was a bit loud, and the students studying under the trees in the distance looked over curiously, but no one should have heard it. Zhang Xiaomeng's face was still red, and she stared at Su Lu angrily and protested, "Lower your voice. Isn't this my first time?" Su Li's next sentence was very fast, and he calmly replied, "So I have to be responsible for you, and you have to be responsible for me." Zhang Xiaomeng suddenly realized that she really wasn't good enough to complete the task that the senator had carefully entrusted to her. She found that it was too difficult to play the role of a girl who dumped her first boyfriend because of vanity. The main reason was that the boy she was supposed to dump, Su Lu, really didn't play by the rules. He didn't hit the tree in anger, nor did he seem to have the impulse to cut her wrist with a blade, nor did he scold her for being shameless. This made her unable to say many of the sarcastic lines she had planned. Perhaps, deep down in her heart, she couldn't bear to hurt him with those words. She looked helplessly at Su Lu, who refused to back down, and softly begged, "Just let me go, I don't need you to be responsible for me. You don't expect a girl like me to be responsible for you, right? Why not?" Su Li's mood had actually fallen to the bottom of the valley, because he had long seen that Zhang Xiaomeng wasn't joking. However, at this moment of crisis in his life, that sense of crisis made his thoughts exceptionally clear. He reacted extremely quickly and said very seriously, "That night, you raped me." Zhang Xiaomeng's face was already completely red because she was afraid that the discussion would be heard by her classmates. At this time, she was so angry that her face turned white. She looked at Su Li's serious face in disbelief, as if she had seen a savage on S2's De Chi Peak. She angrily stammered and said, You're shameless." Su Lu was a shameless person. Even if he had been influenced by Shi Qinghai for so long, it was impossible for him to say anything too outrageous to a girl. He was just a little confused by Zhang Xiaomeng's sudden change in attitude. He was purely subconsciously looking for an excuse to benefit himself. He sadly found that Zhang Xiaomeng seemed to be serious. "Xiaomeng, is there a problem?" The state senator's son, Hai Qingzhou, suddenly appeared beside the two of them, as if he wanted to be the flower's protector. He looked at the gloomy Su Lu warily and protected Zhang Xiaomeng behind him. Zhang Xiaomeng poked her head out from behind Hai Qingzhou's arm and said, "Thank you, it's nothing." She then angrily said to Su Lu, "Don't bother me again." Su Lu acted as if he didn't hear her at all. He directly extended his hand to the senator's son and asked very elegantly, "We've met before." "My name is Su Lu. I'm an auditing student in the mechanical department. Did you ask for guidance?" Zhang Xiaomeng and Hai Qingzhou were a little dumbfounded. They didn't expect Su Li's attitude to change so quickly. Hai Qingzhou gently smiled and said, "Hai Qingzhou, the person who was deducted 4 credits by you last time was me." The two of them shook hands. Su Lu smiled and said, "I didn't expect you to still remember me." Zhang Xiaomeng sighed and said to Su Lu, "Qingzhou will be my dance partner for the Double Moon Festival dance." "Why are you calling Qingzhou so quickly? I cooked porridge for you, but you didn't even look at it. If I had known earlier, I would have given it to that brat to eat." These words didn't come out of Su Li's mouth. He still had a sincere smile on his face, but in his heart, he thought bitterly that these words were too feminine. He would rather die than allow himself to say them out loud. "Don't misunderstand." Zhang Xiaomeng saw the sadness that flashed through Su Li's eyes. Suddenly, her heart ached. She said in a low voice, "I'm not suitable for you. This has nothing to do with Qingzhou. He and I are just normal friends." The sour words in Su Li's heart came out again. He thought to himself that before that day, they were also normal friends. He held it in and smiled gently at Hai Qingzhou. He nodded at Zhang Xiaomeng and said, "Let's talk about it another time. I'm leaving first." Under these circumstances, if he wanted to suppress his emotions, Su Lu could only turn around and leave. He was a 19-year-old youth. When he saw Zhang Xiaomeng with someone of the opposite sex, he felt very uncomfortable. However, he wasn't so tasteless as to fight with someone of the same sex for the sake of stealing the opposite sex. That was something that only bulls would do. Looking at Su Li's back as he walked away, Zhang Xiaomeng suddenly felt that she was really a bad woman. She wasn't acting as a bad woman because that back looked so pitiful. She didn't know why, but she had the urge to call him back. However, when she thought of the Double Moon Festival dance that was just around the corner, she forcefully swallowed those words back. She swallowed them down and felt bitter. Su Lu is a good person. At least he has a good demeanor. Zhang Xiaomeng didn't want Hai Qingzhou, who was beside her, to have too many bad feelings towards Su Lu. This was because she knew that Hai Qingzhou also had a good impression of her. He was the son of a senator. If he wanted to take advantage of Su Lu, what would Su Lu, who was a poor student without parents, do? After being rejected by you, he still smiled and shook hands with me. His demeanor is really not bad. Hai Qingzhou put his right hand behind his back and secretly rubbed it twice. His knuckles were already red and swollen from being pinched by Su Lu. A bitter smile appeared on his lips. He thought to himself that this brat was really angry. When he thought of the scene at the nightclub, he couldn't help but feel a little afraid. Chapter 78. When faced with such a situation, even a clay figurine would get angry. Even if Su Lu was a rock, he had the word resentment engraved on it. What angered him the most was that he didn't even know what went wrong. How did the trees in the pear garden become covered with snow in one night? How did the two moons in the sky collide? How did day become night? How did the two people who were on good terms just a moment ago become strangers? Su Lu was a wild bull that he despised, but this was his first love. In the words that he never forgot to remind Zhang Xiaomeng, this was also his first night. It was impossible for his emotions to immediately brighten up, so when he shook hands with Hai Qingzhou, he subconsciously used more strength. Of course, his facial expression was still very good. Congratulations, congratulations. Shi Qinghai raised a large glass of beer and laughed at the unhappy Su Lu. He sincerely congratulated him. I've seen a lot of one-night stands, but a one-day boyfriend like you is really rare. His congratulations were sincere because he no longer had to worry about any problems between Zhang Xiaomeng and Su Lu. However, these words sounded like vicious mockery to Su Li's ears. He took a big gulp of beer and frowned. This situation is a little strange. I can't accept it. Did you and Zhang Xiaomeng sleep together? Shi Qinghai lit a cigarette and threw the cigarette box over. The problem was that this guy was really too handsome. No matter how sneaky he looked, it was impossible to dislike him. Su Lu was stunned. He immediately thought of that night when he saw the elf wearing the devil's horns. That beautiful and unforgettable time. However, from the perspective of a girl, he couldn't tell the truth to this bad friend in front of him. He shook his head. Shi Qinghai leaned back and sighed. I can't accept it. You know how I look at beautiful girls. If Zhang Xiaomeng didn't wear those black-rimmed glasses in bed, she would definitely be a beautiful little girl. What a pity, what a pity. When Su Lu heard this, he was a little annoyed. He glared at him angrily and took out a cigarette from the pack and lit it up. Shi Qinghai frowned and said, It seems that you are serious. But she only kissed you in the restaurant. That doesn't mean anything. Women are fickle. Maybe she will realize that you have no future after staying at home for 2 days. A sensitive woman will think that a man is riding a white horse when she sees him. But a rational woman will analyze whether the white horse is rented or bought, and whether the horse is pure or not. Regarding the matters between men and women, young Master Shi, as always, hit the nail on the head and was incomparably sharp. However, Su Lu did not listen to these words at all. He was carefully reflecting on his relationship with Zhang Xiaomeng in the past few days and why such a change had happened. Suddenly, he looked up and said, Xiaomeng likes me. Shi Qinghai was stunned for a moment and shook his head. He gave him a thumbs up and said, this is the first time I see you being narcissistic. It's just like how you used to smile obscenely. It's quite like me. Su Lu ignored him. He continued to frown and analyze while smoking. Since she likes me but doesn't want to admit our relationship, then it must be because of our relationship, which is a huge obstacle to something. Matters between men and women will only affect matters between men and women. Recently, she has the son of a senator around her. According to my sources, they got to know each other at a family gathering in the Zhang family. You have sources? Shi Qinghai looked at him in surprise. Su Lu said calmly, I used a pearl necklace to bribe the girl next to Xiaomeng. Continue, Xiaomeng is not a vain person. Even if she wants to be with that plain porridge and side dish, she would not be so stupid to choose such a method and such a time to end our relationship. If I make a scene. Su Lu did not mention what happened that night. If they were to really make things too unpleasant for both parties, this kind of thing would spread. It would be extremely harmful to the development of Zhang Xiaomeng and Hai Qingzhou's relationship. More importantly, I've only just started with her. Any normal woman would be an emotional woman at this time. In your words, she won't even notice what kind of white horse I'm riding. Continue. Shi Qinghai was obviously interested because he realized that Su Li's analysis was indeed reasonable. So she wants to be closer to Hai Qingzhou, not because she likes him, but because she needs to be closer to him during this period of time. Su Li's words were a bit awkward, but the logic was becoming clearer. His knife-like eyebrows raised, and his calm eyes looked past Shi Qinghai's face to look outside the bar. As for the reason, I am not very clear. Of course, you won't help me investigate. Alright, the Federation Investigation Bureau does not care about breakups. Su Lu suddenly frowned and said, last time at the entrance of the nightclub, Hai Qingzhou was with the Zhou family siblings. You once told me that Zhou Yu had already entered Yue University. Could it be that Zhang Xiaomeng wants to get close to Zhou Yu through Hai Qingzhou? But why does she want to get close to Zhou Yu? You said that Zhou Yu's father is a high-ranking official in the Ministry of National Defense. Oh my god. Could it be that Xiaomeng is really working for the anti-government forces? Shi Qinghai's heart trembled. He did not expect Su Lu to be able to deduce so many things randomly, but his expression did not change. He said mockingly, don't find so many strange reasons for yourself. This is too complicated. It's a pity that you don't work for the Federation Investigation Bureau. Those intelligence analysts only know how to analyze the blueprints of battleships' main cannons from the trash. They are all idiots. Su Lu smiled bitterly. He knew that his analysis was too ridiculous. It was all to make himself understand and to make himself feel better. How could a girl like Xiaomeng, who would eat the wrong biscuit, be a spy? But at this time, he did not know that his analysis was infinitely close to the truth. Not only are there no deep-fried pancakes today, there's no supper at all. Tai Ziyuan said into the intercom with a sullen expression. He had just decided not to let butler Jean prepare supper, but he did not expect that the guy on the other side would dare to forget to bring supper. Su Li's feeble reply came from the intercom, I'm in a bad mood today, so I forgot about it. You won't die even if you miss out on a meal. Hearing the rude words, Child C subconsciously prepared to get angry. But he suddenly understood that the guy on the other side, who was always cheerful, actually said that he was in a bad mood. He was instantly overwhelmed by a strong sense of curiosity. He frowned and asked, what happened? Su Li's monotonous voice sounded particularly dejected, I think I just fell in love, but then I mysteriously fell out of love. For some reason, Tai Ziyuan, who looked at those files every day, was suddenly interested in the gossip of the guy in the room. He asked, tell me about it. Su Lu, who was sitting in the mecha's operating cabin with his legs crossed and staring blankly at the high ceiling, suddenly had a thought when he heard the voice coming from the intercom. He thought that perhaps this mysterious fellow could really help him see some problems. That rogue official Shi Qinghai was full of hormones. He was really not a good candidate for studying relationship problems. Moreover, this mysterious fellow did not know who he was, so there were many things that were inconvenient for him to say. Lihua University would not be able to spread rumors about Zhang Xiaomeng anyway. After making up his mind, Su Lu very seriously recounted everything that had happened between him and Zhang Xiaomeng. He did not even avoid the events of that night. Of course, he did not mention the details, and he also left out some parts that might expose his and Zhang Xiaomeng's identities. The intercom was silent for a while, and then the other side suddenly asked, "How long did you last?" A drop of cold sweat trickled down Su Li's temple. He naturally knew that the other side was definitely not asking about how long he had lasted in the lowest level 6 test. After struggling for a long time, he lowered his voice and gave an approximate time in shame. The other side of the intercom was silent for an even longer time, and then came a burst of exaggerated laughter and a sentence that easily pierced Su Li's strong heart. "Actually didn't last as long as you did for level 6, no wonder that woman doesn't want you." Su Lu said resentfully, "Isn't it like this the first time?" Suddenly, he stared at the intercom and said mockingly, "You don't even know this? You're probably still a virgin." Tai Ziyuan, who had been laughing loudly, stopped abruptly. He stared at the intercom, and after a long while, he pretended to be calm and changed the topic. "A woman's heart is like a needle that has sunk to the bottom of the sea. You'll never find it." He didn't want to pay any more attention to Su Li's childish and boring emotional twists and turns, so he said coldly, "Begin." Last night, the outwardly gentle but innately proud young master of the Tai family had been defeated by Su Lu for the first time. Tai Ziyuan had thought that this was a coincidence, or perhaps it was because Su Lu had not brought porridge to eat last night, causing him to perform less well. And today, he had adjusted all his emotions, preparing to give Su Lu a painful and unforgettable mecha education. However, 5 minutes later, Tai Ziyuan's forcefully suppressed voice rang out once more from the intercom. "You just had sex yesterday, so let's say you took an aphrodisiac. Then what medicine did you take today?" Sweating profusely, Su Lu stared at the numbers on the screen with lingering fear. Immersed in the violent thrill of beating up the opponent's mecha, he said, "I just broke up today. Of course what I took was gunpowder." The taste of breaking up was not a good feeling, especially when you couldn't find the reason and couldn't make heads or tails of it. Regardless of whether he was a rock or she was a shrew, every man and woman in puberty had the most delicate and sensitive nerves in their life. Sighs and groans were all caused by the sadness and joy of separation and reunion. Even the slightest change in emotion would be magnified countless times by the young people in the midst of it. 10 years later, they might be able to laugh off their past stubbornness, but 10 years ago, no one would be able to escape this hurdle. In the classroom filled with holographic diagrams, Su Lu narrowed his eyes at the girl sitting in the front row with Hai Qingzhou. He thought to himself, what is love? Love is not a thing. Chapter 79. A warship is made up of 3 major systems, the structural system, the control system, and the propulsion system. Some of you might be thinking about the weapon system. The observation system. I think that students who look at the structure of a warship this way are basically all boys. Professor Zhou, who was sitting on the podium, was so loud that the tiny speaker clipped to his shirt pocket made a noise of protest. He stared at the male students in the classroom and said disdainfully, "Only little boys who like to read magazines would look at problems and recognize problems so simply. Don't forget, these 3 major systems are the foundation of everything. Let's take the Feather series warship as an example. What are the 3 main laser cannons on it made of? A super alloy base and a crystal converter. Transmission control calibration. Energy activation." Professor Zhou raised his thumb and a beam of light appeared on the large screen. He enlarged the blueprint of the Feather 1 warship's main cannon base and pointed to 3 different parts. And these three most important components are the structural system, the control system, and the propulsion system. The energy output from the weapons is ultimately still part of the propulsion system. Of course, if you're talking about artillery shells used by the army, then pretend I didn't say anything. The three major systems don't just exist in the macroscopic scope, they are also the detailed components of every part of the warship. Only when these three major systems can perfectly coordinate and cooperate can, of course, the Feather series warships have been retired a long time ago. Now that the Federation's crystal resources have dried up, I reckon that you won't have many chances to sit on a warship. Oh, the most important point is that our UA University is not like the three major military academies or the Westwoods Military Academy. We don't have a warship command department, so it's useless to talk about this to you. The male students in the classroom laughed and booed, but Professor Zhou didn't care at all and continued to speak excitedly. Then why do I have to spend time talking about this? That's because no matter if it's the mecha you may come into contact with in the future, or those self-propelled armored vehicles, or self-propelled cannons, in the end, they are all small warships or miniature warships. What determines their performance and combat power are the three major systems of structure, control, and propulsion. Motherfucker, I suddenly remember that all of you are going to develop civilian warships in the future. I guess this class was wasted. The classroom was filled with laughter again, only Sulu didn't laugh. He also didn't stare blankly at Zhang Xiaomeng's back. His current mood was indeed somewhat complicated and low, but he would not allow his entire life to be trapped in this inexplicable melancholy. He listened very carefully to Professor Zhou's lecture, and faintly felt that he had gained something. A mecha is a small warship. Sulu repeated Professor Zhou's words in his mind. He recalled the first time he repaired the ancient clock, the large number of M-type mecha blueprints he had read in Area H, and then connected it to his own work in Area H1 these past few nights. He had a deeper understanding of Professor Zhou's theory and connected it to an even stranger direction. This was because Uncle had once told him that the human body was the number one machine. If a mecha was a small battleship, then wouldn't the human body be a small mecha? The human body was also composed of a control system, a structural system, and a power system. The structure naturally referred to the bones, muscles, organs, hair, blood, and skin. The control system naturally referred to the human brain and the transmission of nerves. Only through the transmission of nerve bundles could the consciousness of the brain control the contraction of the muscles, the movement of the joints, the breathing of the lungs, and the operation of these structural systems. Then what was the propulsion system? Naturally, the food consumed by the human body was converted into energy by the organs through digestion and absorption. The energy was stored in the human body as fat, blood sugar, and oxygen into the bloodstream. Then, the body would burn them to provide the human body with an endless supply of energy. Sulu thought about it silently. His body seemed to be different from the average person in terms of the last two systems. For example, when he operated the mecha, the consciousness of his brain seemed to be transmitted to his limbs through a completely new channel, and the mysterious trembling power in his body was obviously not something that could be activated through normal means. Every time he tried it, he would become so hungry. It should have something to do with the special characteristics of this energy, right? Sulu was satisfied with this speculation. He raised his head to look at the girl's back and began to feel dissatisfied again. The three major systems of his body were developing in the direction of becoming stronger, but unfortunately, the mysterious things like the heart and emotions could not become more numb. That little gatekeeper has been waiting outside the plum garden for 5 hours already. You really don't want to go down and take a look? Outside the door came the sounds of jeering and teasing from the girls. Perhaps some of them were really Zhang Xiaomeng's friends, but most of them were just here to watch the show. Zhang Xiaomeng had always been quiet and reserved in front of everyone, distant and cold. In addition to her past, she was actually not very popular among the girls of UA University. Zhang Xiaomeng ignored the noise outside. Without her permission, the electronic door would not allow anyone to barge in. She also did not care much about other people's opinions or teasing. Other than in front of that young boy, she felt that she rarely lost her cool. Walking to the window, in the distance was the reflection of the Rose River under the night sky. Nearby was the lawn below the plum garden. On the edge of the lawn was a boy standing there like a rock. He had been standing there since class ended until night. Not only his body, even his expression did not seem to have changed. Zhang Xiaomeng stared at the boy in a daze. She picked up a cute little dog biscuit from the table and put it in her mouth. As she chewed, her eyes became moist. She was extremely distressed. The reason she was distressed was because she felt that she was very stupid. Since she knew that this would happen, she should not have acted that way that day. She should not have provoked him. Now that he was like this, and she was also this upset, she still had to pretend to be disgusting. It had to be admitted that Zhang Xiaomeng was a very kind person. Otherwise, she would not have given up on her beautiful family background and thrown herself into the business of seeking benefits for the lower class of the Federation. However, even though she had received training in S2, and the black-rimmed glasses made her look mature, she was still incomparably naive and childish when it came to matters between men and women. She was a complete mess. At this moment, the phone rang. Zhang Xiaomeng put it to her ear and heard Su Li's voice. Su Li was a love-struck fool, and he was not the kind of man who would cry and shout about hanging himself. He was just very stubborn as a rock. He had to figure out the reason for Zhang Xiaomeng's sudden change in attitude, so he waited in the plum garden for half a night before finally getting through. He stopped Zhang Xiaomeng from questioning him about how he got the phone number and said calmly, "Don't be so cold. You're not Jian Shuier, and your acting isn't that good. Give up. I don't know what you're hiding, but I just want to tell you that this trick won't work on me. I'm guessing that you're looking at me from the window in the dark right now, and you're sincerely moved. Maybe you're even crying." After standing for a long time, Su Lu finally used the ruthlessness of the Clocktower Street orphan gang. He raised his head to look at the 7th floor, and said each word to the point, "Don't you think this is very childish?" Zhang Xiaomeng was originally looking at Su Lu downstairs with tears in her eyes, but the 2 sentences that came out of the phone made her feel very conflicted. She hung up the phone and crawled into bed. The phone call ended, but Su Lu didn't leave the plum garden. He felt that his heart was empty, and if he didn't get the girl's warmth or words to fill it, it seemed like it would be empty forever. This was his first love, or at least, it was her first night. He thought that both of them should cherish it. So he acted like he cherished it and worked hard, and so he stood in the plum garden and waited. It was late autumn, and Su Lu was an impulsive person. He was already prepared. He put on his thermal underwear and put on the green military windbreaker he got at the airport. It was the same one he wore when he first met Zhang Xiaomeng. First, it was warm, and second, it made her think of him. This was the most comprehensive arrangement that Su Lu, who was new to love, could think of. However, he miscalculated how much the heavens hated this kind of thing. A cold autumn rain came out of nowhere and drenched him. He wiped the rain off his face and looked at the sky with some annoyance. The plum garden was silent. Even the girls who came to watch the show had fallen asleep. Only the rain accompanied his figure, making him look very lonely. Later in the night, a girl who woke up in the middle of the night found the man in the rain and let out a low cry. In the deepest part of the night, the autumn rain suddenly turned into the first snow in the north of the planet. The floating snowflakes fell just like that, landing on Su Li's body and gradually cooling his body and his heart. In the early morning, Su Lu brushed the snow off his body and left the plum garden silently. He felt that it was too cold. He could ask more about it during the ball. Zhang Xiaomeng's face appeared in the window on the 7th floor of the plum garden. She looked at Su Li's footprints in the thin snow with some loneliness. She thought to herself that he had probably lost all hope in her. Su Lu didn't go back to take a hot shower and go to sleep. Firstly, there wasn't much time left. Secondly, his incomparably strong body over the years had never seemed to have any problems with colds. Thirdly, there was a fire in his heart. There was no bright fire, which made him very depressed. He needed to find a way to vent. He silently walked into the still empty H1 area. He thought that the mysterious kid should have already gone to sleep by now. He could only roar at the light and color blocks in the 6th level. To his surprise, the small table in the lounge was already empty. However, the green indicator light for the door was still on. Could that guy still be inside? According to the usual practice, it was already 4 in the morning. Both he and that person should have gotten rid of the trouble of insomnia. Sulu, who was drenched all over, felt a trace of worry. He suddenly forgot that he was actually in the darkest moment of his youth and walked toward that room.